Order. Colleagues, we now come to the emergency debate. Just before I call the opening speaker, I should point out that no fewer than 22 backbench members are seeking to contribute, and there will have to be a time limit. How strict depends on the early part of the debate. Stella Creasy.
Mr. Speaker, I want to start by thanking Mr. Speaker for granting this debate and all the cross-party support that this debate has received. I always believe that abortion is a non-partisan issue, and I want to pay particular tribute again to the members for Totnes, Eastern Bartonshire, Dwyfor Meirionnydd, Brighton Pavilion and Kingston upon Hull North for their work on these issues, and in particular the member for Kingston upon Hull North who laid the efforts for this debate in her work on decriminalisation. There are many issues ahead of us here today: decriminalisation, devolution, domestic abuse, but above all I want to say it's about a particular D: dignity. The dignity of women to be able to choose for themselves what to do with their own bodies. I'm also proud to have been able to work with the Alliance for Choice, the London Irish Abortion Rights Campaign, BPAS, the Family Planning Association, Mary Stopes and Amnesty International on this issue. We have not stopped planning for this issue since last year's vote to secure access for Northern Irish women to abortion here on the NHS. Because the truth is that we knew that solution didn't answer the test that Arlene Foster herself has set to ensure that the men and women of Northern Ireland are not treated differently by the United Kingdom government. But it is the impact of the Irish referendum that brings us here today. The Irish Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar, welcomed the yes vote in Ireland a week ago, saying that Ireland will no longer say to women, take the boat or take the plane, when they need an abortion. Instead, he said, Ireland will say, take our hand. It is now time for us to offer our hands to the women of Northern Ireland in the same way. Women who face a situation where if they are raped and seek a termination, they will face a longer prison sentence than their attacker. Women who, when they have a heartbreaking diagnosis of a fatal fetal abnormality, have to go abroad to seek treatment. Women who are currently on trial. Indeed, there is a mother of a 15-year-old girl who was in an abusive relationship who is currently being prosecuted for having bought her daughter misoprostol online. I'll happily give way.
I thank her for giving way and for securing this very important debate today. But does she agree with me that because abortion hasn't been decriminalised in Northern Ireland, women are still going for abortions, whether that be travelling to the UK by a great expense or alternatively, the worst case scenario, backstreet abortions, which is something that I'm sure we all want to avoid in this House.
My honourable friend makes a very key point here, which is stopping the provision of abortion does not stop abortions happening. It simply increases the risk of a woman either having to make that degrading and lonely journey to another country or risking buying those pills online and the problems that come with them. Indeed, seeking the possibility of the threat of prosecution if something goes wrong with the pills and she seeks medical help. I will happily give way to one of my co-sponsors first, if you'll understand.
I'm grateful to her for giving way and want to pay tribute for all of her work in getting this important debate and much more besides. She will know that the UN Committee on Ending Discrimination Against Women have called this situation in Northern Ireland, the fact that it constitutes a grave and systematic violation of human rights. Does she agree with me that it's essential that we send out a message from this chamber today to any woman or girl in Northern Ireland saying that we are with you, we will continue to stand up for your human rights and we won't stop until they get them?
I thank my own friend for that intervention. Yes, the UN has criticised us. So too we know this week the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commissioner has brought an appeal to the Supreme Court that will rule on whether or not the situation in Northern Ireland breaches the European Convention on Human Rights. It is worth remembering when we're talking about Northern Ireland that the UK committed alongside Ireland in the Good Friday Agreement to upholding the human rights of all citizens in Northern Ireland. And it's that commitment we are asking the government to honour, because the Good Friday Agreement was the basis for institutions being obliged to comply with those obligations under the Human Rights Act. But without the institutions that exist in Northern Ireland, those rights are not being upheld. Because I'll happily give way.
I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way, and may I too add my name to congratulate her on this debate today. Does she not agree with me that it is surprising but rather wonderful, actually, that the Republic of Ireland is actually leading the way on this, and indeed also on gay marriage? And does she agree with me that, notwithstanding the fact that, of course, Northern Ireland is devolved, they should look now to the south and say they are leading the way and we should follow?
I would like to join with my colleague. I hope he was also as supportive as I was the wonderful work that the member for St Helens did on equal marriage and bringing the case for equal marriage in Northern Ireland, a case I wholeheartedly support, and I hope the government will too. Because devolution, even when it's functioning, does not relieve this place of our responsibility to uphold human rights, whether in Northern Ireland or elsewhere. I'll give 1 minute when I'm making progress.
Thank you. Well, the Honourable Lady would know that I would respect devolution as a Welsh MP more than most, having to live it every day of my life. But this issue, and that of equal marriage in Northern Ireland, deserves to be tackled in the here and the now, and not use devolution as an excuse to deny the women of the right of abortion and to prevent equal marriage. This is 2018. Both of these issues are contemporary. They're about equality and they're about basic human rights.
As ever, I agree completely with my Welsh comrade. Mr Speaker, this outdated legislation is not just having an impact in Northern Ireland, and that's why this is a matter for the whole of this House. Because women across England and Wales are also buying pills online rather than seeking repeated visits to doctors. One study alone showed that in one 4-month period last year, 500 British women attempted to access abortion pills from one online supplier alone, and so would be liable to prosecution under this archaic rule as a result. This situation, then, is not simply about Northern Ireland. It's about legislation this House has passed and why this House must act. But I want to be very specific today in what I am proposing, because I understand there are concerns about this issue. Of course I will give way.
I'm very grateful indeed to the Honourable Lady. And this is, of course, a very, very sensitive and controversial issue, particularly in Northern Ireland. I need to reflect to the Honourable Lady that I've received a large number of emails from constituents who feel that MPs at Westminster are usurping the powers and the responsibilities of the Northern Ireland Assembly during a period when we haven't had a functioning Assembly, and I wish we did have one, and I'm looking to my colleagues here on the bench to urge them to have the Assembly up and running again. How can the Honourable Lady reassure my constituents that today's debate, an important debate, a very important debate, does not undermine the devolution settlement in Northern Ireland?
I thank the Honourable Friend for that question and absolutely wish to take up the challenge that she presents, because I completely respect the point of view that she's putting forward. Let me therefore make some progress and set out precisely what it is we are putting forward. The Offences Against the Person Act 1861 puts abortion in the same category as homicide, destroying or damaging a building with the use of gunpowder with the intent to murder, child stealing, rape or defilement of women. Abortion might be the most common procedure that our constituents who are women of reproductive age undergo, but even today in 2018, we don't let them make the choice themselves to have that procedure. So what we would like to do is repeal sections 58 and 59 of OPA. But letting sections 58 and 59 stay on the statute does not address many of the challenges that we see today in abortion provision. For example, extending the 1967 Act does not address the impact of the pills I discussed, or indeed that paternalism that says that women are not trusted to make choices about their bodies. But in repealing those particular sections of OPA, I also want to be clear what we're not doing. This is not an attempt to remove the criminal charges that come after 24 weeks. Let me make that explicitly clear, because I have seen some briefings from some anti-choice organisations that suggest otherwise. We are not intending to amend the Infant Life Preservation Act 1929 that covers and still has the power to criminalise abortions after 24 weeks of pregnancy. Decriminalising abortion up to 24 weeks of pregnancy would mean that the 1967 Abortion Act would become redundant before 24 weeks of pregnancy. As abortion before 24 weeks of pregnancy would no longer be a crime, you would no longer need the 1967 Act to act as a defence to women who had sought an abortion. However, the exemptions that the 1967 Act provides for terminations post 24 weeks would remain, and the 1967 Act would provide exemptions to prosecutions under the Infant Life Preservation Act, for example, in cases of severe fetal abnormality or where the mother's life is at risk. That might seem complicated. Let me put it as simply as possible. The time limit would not change, nor would the important role of medics in this matter. Now, I respect and recognise that some people do not consider abortion a human right, and so think a criminal approach is the right response. But I recognise many more agree it's not that worries them, but the constitutional issues that are at stake. Even though the Good Friday Agreement explicitly retained human rights responsibilities for this place, let me reassure those MPs who want to uphold the role of devolved assemblies that repealing OPA would not write a particular abortion law for anyone, but it would require them to act. This proposal would respect devolution. It would not reject it. I'll happily give way to my colleague.
I just want to be absolutely clear. What I think the Honourable Lady is suggesting there is that Northern Ireland has UK abortion at 24 weeks and not Republic of Ireland abortion at 12 weeks. Is that correct?
Let me reassure the gentleman, I'm not proposing any particular law. What we are talking about doing is repealing the existing UK legislation that then requires Northern Irish law to act in a certain way. In doing so, unlike imposing a referendum or extending the 1967 Act, it would be in line with both our human rights responsibilities, which is why the United Nations has asked us to do this, and it would not impose a specific outcome on Northern Ireland. Indeed, I believe that holding a referendum, if I can, I'll make a little bit of progress, and absolutely I'll give way to my friend from Dwiff or Mirinev first.
Would she not explain possibly and possibly agree with me that this actually, by repealing the Offences Against the Person Act, actually gives more powers to devolution in that event?
Absolutely. My colleague in writing this proposal is absolutely right. What it does is it simply means that the Northern Irish Assembly, if it's reconstituted, cannot ignore this issue because there would be a gap that would then need to be filled by medical regulation. If I can, I'd like to make a little bit of progress because I realise some of this is quite technical. I also want to set out very clearly why a referendum is not the right approach. Because those who are suggesting it needs to be clear about what the question would be, what they would consult the public on, indeed who would write the question, or indeed whether, if that law were passed, who would then implement it. And indeed, if we were to have a referendum on bringing abortion rights to Northern Ireland or a particular form of abortion, would then we also allow a referendum, say, on other contested issues, such as the union itself? That's why I may not share the views of my colleagues from the DUP about a woman's right to choose, but I find myself in agreement with the member for Langan Valley, who I know has written to one of his constituents, saying that inevitably it is Westminster politicians who will have to make a call on this particular proposal, and that he recognises that this is a law that applies to the whole of the United Kingdom and not just Northern Ireland, and so it is right for MPs in this House to consider whether repealing sections 58 and 59 of OPA is the right thing to do. I also note that he recognises and acknowledges there is no substantive support amongst local political parties in Northern Ireland for extending the 67 Act because people would like to be able to write their own legislation. By repealing OPA, we make that a possibility, and therefore we make that a possibility in England and in Wales as well. I'll happily give way.
I thank her for giving way. Just to be absolutely clear, will she agree repealing the 1861 Act allows us to adhere and respect devolution settlements and women's right to choose? They are not contradictory.
Absolutely, and indeed it is in line with respecting the work that has gone on in the Northern Irish Assembly when it was constituted on abortion rights, the working parties that have started to look at the kinds of medical regulation that may be required. Because there isn't an assembly at the moment, those rules cannot be taken forward. But even if there was an assembly, OPA, unless it is repealed, would define that conversation. I'll happily give way.
Thank the member for giving way. The member will of course know that in 2016, when the Assembly debated this matter, They rejected totally the proposals that she is actually making to the House. Does she agree with me that by removing sections 58 and 59, there would be no regulatory framework in Northern Ireland whatsoever to govern legal abortions? There would be a massive hole left in the law in Northern Ireland, and there would be no right by the medical practitioners to actually exercise their conscientious objection to this.
I thank the Honourable for his intervention, because I think it's helpful for people to understand how the DUP interpret the situation. I obviously interpret the situation differently, because I look at what happened in the Assembly when actually the DUP argued that the idea required proper consideration. So they didn't reject the idea. This is around fatal-fetal abnormality, and indeed set up a working party which has just reported a report about how the conditions to access to medical abortion may or may not occur. So the idea that this was rejected out of hand by the Assembly I don't think is fair. I also would gently highlight to the gentleman from Northern Ireland that there have been 2 Assembly elections since then, so there's no guarantee that the view of the Assembly would be the same as the view in 2016. And indeed, the argument he is making is precisely for the Northern Irish Assembly, or indeed the civil servants, to be able to fill the gap, rather than against the gap being created by repealing this UK legislation. Let me also be clear to other members here who may have heard the suggestion that there wouldn't be any safeguards. If I can, I'm just going to continue a little bit. Well, then I'll happily give way, because I'd love to hear what the member has to say.
Thank you. Until directly before coming to this House, I actually worked for 2 years in gynaecology clinics, and one of those clinics was termination of pregnancy clinics. And actually, if a doctor's got a conscientious objection, they don't have to sign Certificate A's. They can come out of that process and not do that.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her contribution to this debate. It is much welcomed. Let me also reassure members that, like every other medical procedure, there are safeguards in place that are not held within OPA itself or even within the Abortion Act, but existing medical regulation. Therefore, these would not change with decriminalisation. Indeed, the 1967 Act, which is supposed to safeguard women, says nothing about informed consent. It's entirely silent on these issues. Clinicians are required by law to obtain informed consent before performing any medical procedure or risk criminal sanction. What we are asking for, then, is for abortion to be subject to exactly the same medical regulations as all other procedures. By repealing OPA as the UK Parliament, we can show women across the UK we trust them with their own health care, wherever they live. We also can show that we trust every legislator, including Northern Ireland, to create modern abortion laws. So the crucial issue before those of us who support decriminalisation is when can we do this? And this is the question for me for the ministers today. Because the government is currently consulting... actually, I'll happily give way one more time, and I really do want to make progress.
The honourable member has mentioned that this is very technical and there's a lot of legislation to go through. But can I ask her one small question? In her aims and objectives and all of this, where does the rights of the unborn child and life to that child come into this? Where does it come into it?
So, if I may, I will happily come on to the question about rights and about the moral debates around abortion, because I recognise there are different decisions within this House and indeed within Northern Ireland on this issue. And therefore, that's why this is not a partisan issue. So if I may, I'd like to finish my point, and then I will come on to exactly the point that he's making. Because the government is currently consulting on domestic abuse legislation. And indeed, I have previously met with the former Home Secretary to discuss this and the opportunity this bill presents to make progress. Now, I understand from ministers their concern to stop abortion being used to control women, and so their interest in OPA within that legislation was perhaps different to mine. I would also highlight to them that the Serious Crimes Act 2015 criminalises controlling or coercive behaviour in family or intimate relationships. Indeed, I would argue that the men who've been prosecuted under OPA for intentionally causing the loss of a wanted pregnancy could well have been prosecuted under existing assault law. Furthermore, organisations like Women's Aid and End Violence Against Women both support decriminalisation because they recognise the current criminalisation puts vulnerable women at risk. A study showed 1 in 5 women who bought pills online did so because they were in a violent or controlling relationship. We don't protect women by criminalising them. That's why so many medical bodies are also calling for decriminalisation. The Royal Colleges and the British Medical Association, just some of them. Indeed, the president of the Obstetrics and Gynaecologists has argued that the legal situation in Northern Ireland means that their healthcare professionals struggle to provide the support they would like to for women who need an abortion or to safely manage any post-abortion complications. We know too that this is the view of the Northern Irish public, that the majority, whether they come from any particular political background, religious background, age or ethnicity, would like to see abortion being managed as a medical rather than a criminal issue. So I have respect for those people who hold a difference of view on abortion itself and the role that it plays in equality. But I see abortion as an equalities issue, because men and women will never truly be free whilst one cannot control what happens to their own body. Indeed, as the residents of Gilead have shown us, it is fundamental to human rights. So I make no apology putting the safety and dignity of women first as part of equality between the sexes. I know the abuse that I will get online for saying so, because frankly, women get the blame whatever we do in our situations. Indeed, judging by the emails I've had today, it's either mine or my mother's fault. I made the mistake that many MPs make of actually reading my emails today. Your views are a disgrace to humanity and a betrayal of the truly innocent. Women can always say no or keep their clothes on. You, madam, were once an embryo. You, madam, were once a fetus in your mother's womb. You were once a pre-born baby. I wonder what decision you have wanted your mother to make about your life or death had she been given the opportunity in the months before you were born. Now, I respect those who disagree with abortion on all grounds as a matter of faith. And I say to those who only think of the extremes this simplest point. If you only support access to abortion in cases of rape or incest or fatal fetal abnormality, then in essence your concern is more about the manner that a woman became pregnant in than abortion. Why does it matter to trust women and give them the chance to control their own bodies, not to be forced to continue an unwanted pregnancy? Because it is about freedom. So shout at me all you want. This is not Gilead, and we should not be frightened to speak up for the equal rights of women. Because to do so is to put women's life and liberation at risk. Because the truth is, in 2018, we still don't trust our own women. This is the one healthcare decision that no UK woman can make on her own. That's why the UN has called on us to repeal these specific sections of law. And no assembly, or indeed this place, can make any progressive law for itself on this subject without doing so. So in supporting this proposal, every member can send a message that in 2018, all the women of the UK deserve to be treated as equal citizens. I'm just about to finish. 100 years ago, 150 years rather, is a long time to wait for social justice. So let's not wait anymore. Today, we ask the ministers to commit to a timetable when the will of the House can be tested on this issue, where rather than waiting 150 years, we wait at most 150 days before we see change, so that we truly get, in the 21st century laws. That the D of the debate is today, but that we have a time for the other D, decision-making, in order to bring dignity to all of our constituents. I ask the ministers, give us a date.
Order. The question is that this House has considered the role of the UK Parliament in repealing sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Person Act 1861. I'm afraid it will be necessary, on account of the heavily subscribed character of the debate, to begin with a limit on backbench speeches of 6 minutes. Mrs. Maria Miller.
Mr. Speaker, and can I apologise to the House for the fact I've got to leave this debate early today, but I could not resist the Honourable Lady for Walthamstow's impassioned call for a debate yesterday and to be here today to take part in it. It deserves a debate, and we should never be afraid to say what we think in this place, particularly on issues of conscience. And we need a change. In 2016, 724 women from Northern Ireland travelled from Northern Ireland to England for abortion care. I think it's wrong that women in Northern Ireland don't have the same access to abortion as my constituents do, and I would like to thank BPAS in Basingstoke, and particularly their manager there at Annette Service, for writing to me with her impassioned plea for change in this area. I believe that this situation should not exist. The fact that the same rights are not available to 1 in 4 parts of the UK is difficult to understand. Not even for fatal fetal abnormalities, rape or incest. Why, oh why, in 2003, was it decided to devolve this sensitive matter that relates to international obligations, such as the one the Honourable Lady talked about, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of discrimination against women, and indeed the Istanbul Convention. It is difficult to understand from even the Hansard transcript the rationale for why this was done in this way. And in many ways, it feels as if the rights of Northern Irish women were traded as part of the devolution settlement. People in Northern Ireland want change. The Northern Ireland Assembly has acknowledged that, and the Department of Justice report that was issued in 2015 said very clearly that there was a pressing need to change the criminal law to provide terminations in clearly defined circumstances. The general public wants change, and indeed the latest Amnesty International poll suggests that 68% of Northern Irish people feel that people should not be punished if they have an abortion. Professional bodies want change. The Royal College of Midwives, the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists.
Would my honourable friend give way?
Indeed.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend for giving way. Does she think, therefore, perhaps the time has come for a referendum on this subject in Northern Ireland, just as there has been in the Irish Republic?
My honourable friend's brought up an important issue, and I'll come on to that in a moment. And I think there may be a role for a way for people in Northern Ireland to express their views at a time when they don't have a functioning Northern Ireland Assembly. Mr. Speaker, I was talking about the people calling for change, whether it's the Northern Ireland Assembly, Department of Justice, the general public, professional bodies, but also, as the Honourable Lady for Walthamstow talked about, the courts also considering the need for change as well. And there is a case before the Supreme Court which will be pronounced upon very shortly. I really commend the... I'll take the Honourable Lady, then I must make some progress.
Well, Lady for giving way, and she's making a powerful case for change in this area. I wonder if she could tell the House what she now believes would be the best course for her government to take to facilitate a decision in this area.
Thank the Honourable Lady for her intervention. I'm just going to come on to that in the very short time I've got remaining. I commend the Honourable Lady for Walthamstow for bringing this before us today. But I think the House has to understand, and I think she made it clearer perhaps today than she did in her intervention yesterday, that repealing 58 and 59 of the Offences against the Person Act would have some profound impacts for the whole of the United Kingdom. I'm not saying that those changes aren't ones that could be argued for strongly, but I believe that the debate today was about the situation facing women in Northern Ireland. And I think we need to make sure that we are focusing on that particularly in this conversation today, because decriminalisation is an option, she's right, but it's not the only option for improving the situation for women in Northern Ireland. And I'd just like to draw on 3 particular issues that we consider in this debate today. Firstly, is there a disconnect between public opinion and the policies that are being pursued in Northern Ireland? What progress has actually been made on the ground, and what action, if any, can this government take to make sure that if progress is lacking, then things can be done to rectify that? It feels to me when I read the research, and I read the consultation, which was extensive and very thorough, that there can be a strong argument made for a call for change being inherent in the community in Northern Ireland. I don't represent that community, and I look at the honourable gentleman and lady over on the other side of the benches, and I hope in their contribution to today they're able to explain why there is an apparent difference between the public opinion that is being offered to us and the approach that's been taken to date by the devolved administration. And I deliberately tread carefully on this and respectfully, because I truly believe that we should not enter into any changes here which would make people feel disenfranchised as part of this process. I think we have to secondly recognise that a great deal of progress has already been made, and I think that probably hasn't gone into in a great deal of detail so far in this debate. The consultation in 2014, the report in 2015 calling, as I say, for a pressing need for change in the criminal law to provide lawful terminations in clearly defined circumstances, that has already been called for. In 2016, legislation introduced by the then Minister for Justice to bring about some of those changes. And then in 2018, just last month, a report from a working group on fatal fetal abnormalities, again recommending change, comes in. So change is called for. What can we do now today to try and make sure that the absence of an executive and an assembly doesn't stand in the way of that? There are clearly opportunities around the court case that's going through the Supreme Court, and I hope the Minister's able to share with us more the government's feelings on that. Also, what action, perhaps the Minister can also talk about what action is able to be taken in the absence of an executive to continue the deliberations and the important detailed work that's needed in this place, if the lady could forgive me. And also, can the Minister consider and share with the House, if no action is taken, which I simply don't believe will be the case, but if that is the case, that no action is taken when there is a Northern Ireland Assembly formed, what can this government do to ensure that there are no potential breaches of international conventions such as the ones that I've already talked about? Mr. Speaker, this place legislated to devolve powers on abortion to Northern Ireland. We can't ride roughshod over that, and we have a responsibility to uphold the law. Equally, the lack of a functioning assembly hampers progress. Westminster has a right to disagree with the Assembly and the actions that it's taken, and this debate today should be a vigorous exploration of all those arguments. But we have clear international responsibilities for outlawing discrimination against women, and we need to make sure that we, as Westminster parliamentarians, are doing that for women in the four corners of this United Kingdom.
Well done. Thank you. Sir Geoffrey Donaldson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and I welcome the opportunity to speak in this debate as a Member of Parliament, having represented my constituency for 21 years. I sometimes listen to debates in this place, and I think that when people look at me, they think that I have a disconnect with the people that I represent. Frankly, Mr. Speaker, I would not have been returned to this House for my 6th term in Parliament if I was so disconnected from the people I represent. I am their voice in this House, and I respect the voices of others, but I think the voices of the elected representatives from Northern Ireland should be heard on this debate. It is an issue of great sensitivity, which deeply divides opinion both in this House and indeed beyond it, and in Northern Ireland. The subject of abortion incites strong and passionate responses for understandable reasons. I take part in this debate with that reality firmly in mind. My party has been from its very inception a pro-life party. We believe law and policy in Northern Ireland should affirm and uphold the rights of both mothers and unborn children. We have not been alone in Northern Ireland in upholding this stance. Politicians across the political divide and the religious spectrum in Northern Ireland and indeed in other parts of the United Kingdom have and continue to hold a similar view to this party. This includes both Unionists and Nationalists in Northern Ireland, and indeed people of all faiths and none. Nationalist parliamentarians like the former member for Foyle Mark Durkan, who spoke eloquently in this House in defence of the pro-life position. Yep. Some of the best proponents of a pro-life position in Northern Ireland have come from the Republican tradition. Right. People like Francie Brawley, a former Sinn Féin MLA. Yep. People like his wife, Anne, who was the former mayor of Limavady. Both Sinn Féin representatives who hold a pro-life position. So the idea that the only party in Northern Ireland that is pro-life, that holds this view, is the DUP is a nonsense, and that it betrays an ignorance of the political situation in Northern Ireland and of the views of political parties that I would encourage members to acquaint themselves more closely with. It is, of course.
Is the honourable gentleman aware that in countries where abortion is legally restricted, there are 37 abortions per 1,000 women? Where abortion is readily available, there are 34 abortions per 1,000 women. Restrictive abortion laws do not prevent women from seeking abortion. They only endanger women's health and lives as women seek unsafe procedures. That is not pro-life.
Well said.
Well, I beg to differ with the honourable lady, and research in Northern Ireland shows that since 1967 and the introduction of the Abortion Act here, 100,000 people in Northern Ireland are alive today because we did not accept that law in Northern Ireland. That is research that has been backed up with proper scientific fact. And therefore I am proud of that pro-life position. I am proud of the fact that there are so many people alive in Northern Ireland today because we have a law that respects the rights of both women and of the unborn child, and we will maintain that position. Mr. Speaker, contrary to some of the claims made by some in favour of liberalising the law in Northern Ireland, the law in Northern Ireland has been shown to reduce the number of abortions in our jurisdiction. That is a fact. And the Both Lives Matter campaign, which has been very effective in Northern Ireland, has demonstrated with its research that this is the case. For that reason, I am very thoughtful about any change in the law in Northern Ireland. Furthermore, we have long argued that it is for the people of Northern Ireland, through the Northern Ireland Assembly, to decide on what the law on abortion should be, and I very much respect the points made by the honourable lady, the right honourable lady, the member for Basingstoke, in that regard, and we thank her for that acknowledgement. This House in 2008 made a decision to devolve to Northern Ireland the policing and justice powers, as the right honourable lady reminded us. This House took that decision, and it included the power to decide what the law on abortion in Northern Ireland should be. And the Labour Party was the government in power at that time. They took that decision. And I would just remind my right honourable and honourable colleagues from the Labour Party that they actually don't contest elections in Northern Ireland. Therefore, if they want to test the water in this, we invite them to come and to contest elections in Northern Ireland and to put their views forward. We are a functioning democracy, and I might point out that their sister party in Northern Ireland is a pro-life party. I must move on, Mr. Speaker, on this issue. For our part, the DUP stands ready to take its place in both the Assembly and the Executive. Today and without preconditions, we are ready to take on responsibility for governing Northern Ireland. And we stand ready to work with other parties to take decisions on sensitive issues like abortion, to arrive at an outcome that reflects the will of the people of Northern Ireland, that respects the rights of both women and unborn children, and upholds the principle that both lives matter.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I welcome, and does he agree with me, that although there are deeply sensitive issues we must consider in Northern Ireland, such as life-limiting conditions also referred to as fatal fetal abnormality, what this proposal would do would be to impose on the people of Northern Ireland one of the most liberal abortion regimes anywhere in the world, of abortion on demand up to 24 weeks in the absence and it's a fact in the absence of a regime or guidelines, because currently those do not exist, and if this went ahead, there would be nothing there apart from the legality and decriminalisation up to 24 weeks.
I thank the honourable member for South Belfast for that intervention. And in truth, Mr Speaker, if what is proposed under this motion was to actually happen, it would have dramatic consequences for Northern Ireland. And that is absolutely clear. And I think even the mover of the motion acknowledged that there would be a very significant gap. So we need to have this debate in Northern Ireland, a reasoned debate that engages the political parties and civil society, so that we can collect the voices and come to a decision on how best to proceed in regard to the law on abortion. Indeed, within the Northern Ireland Executive, the DUP supported the establishment of the expert working group, which has now published its report, specifically on the question of unborn children who have been diagnosed with a life-limiting condition. We are considering that report, which has recently been published, and the key recommendations it makes. This is a very sensitive area, and women in receipt of such devastating diagnosis deserve our utmost sympathy and our support. No one could fail to be moved by the harrowing cases of those who have found themselves in such tragic circumstances. And we want to develop a new Northern Ireland-wide service for women in these circumstances to ensure that they receive the best information and advice, coordinated care, and to ease their journey through our healthcare system. I'm also keen to ensure that we enhance our perinatal palliative care with a view to Northern Ireland becoming an exemplar in this region, in this area. But we want to listen to the voices, Mr Speaker, of civil society. We want to listen to what people have to say. Voices of women like Sarah Urick, who has spoken passionately about her own experience of pregnancy and abortion in the most difficult of circumstances, and has argued for the case for change in cases involving unborn children with life-limiting conditions. But I also refer to the voice of my own constituent, who wrote to me last evening when hearing about this debate and said, apparently there is to be a discussion in the Commons on our abortion laws. As the daughter of a rape victim and a non-represented Catholic, I would ask that you take a positive pro-life stance and protect the most vulnerable in our society. Mr Speaker, there are strong voices on both sides of this debate. This is a devolved issue. It should be left to the people of Northern Ireland to decide.
Well, the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, I remind colleagues that inexorably the time limit on backbench speeches will fall if there are huge numbers of interventions, though interventions inevitably there are, that's part of the debate, and if frontbenchers not so constrained were inadvertently to dilate at excessive length. And I know that they won't, because that would be uncollegiate, and they won't want to be uncollegiate. The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, Secretary Karen Bradley.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And can I start by welcoming the opportunity to take part in this debate on this incredibly important issue. I pay tribute to the Honourable Lady and all honourable members who have secured this debate, and I pay particular tribute to the Honourable Lady. She has campaigned on this issue for many years. I know she will continue to campaign on it, and I always welcome the opportunity to hear her incredibly passionate and moving contribution. I also want to apologise, Mr Speaker. As you know, I will need to leave the chamber before the end of the debate. My honourable friend, the member for North West Cambridgeshire, will be here throughout the whole debate, as are ministers from government departments that cover a whole spectrum of the issues that we are debating today. And I will ensure that if there are specific points that need responding to, that I do respond personally to members who make them during the debate. I and you, Mr Speaker, have listened very carefully to all of the different views that have been expressed today and previously on this matter, and it is clear that there are a range of views across this House. I'm also aware of the personal stories that lie behind this issue. Abortion is a very sensitive issue, regardless of where your views lie. It is therefore important that we debate this issue with due care and sensitivity, and that is why I stood yesterday to support the Honourable Lady in securing this debate. It has long been the case that the issue of abortion has been a matter of conscience in this House, a matter which has been and which will continue to be subject to a free vote. And while I appreciate that the recent referendum in Ireland has undoubtedly reinvigorated debate within Northern Ireland and across the rest of the United Kingdom, we have to be careful not to react without careful consideration. I will.
Giving way, and is she going to that point where she's travelling today in her speech, where she's acknowledging that what we're actually debating today is not about Northern Ireland? That what we have in front of us is a proposal that would fundamentally change forever the rules governing abortion across the whole of the United Kingdom. And that should not be done in the heat of the moment following something that happened in a foreign jurisdiction in the Republic of Ireland.
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman makes an important point, and I think that it is important to note that the proposals that we're debating today would have an implication across the whole United Kingdom, but I will restrict my remarks to Northern Ireland, if he will forgive me. Of course.
I'm very grateful, and I'm grateful for the tone that she's adopting in this debate. Can I just say to her, though, that in the previous Parliament in March 2017, this issue of the repeal of Section 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Persons Act 1861 was debated. I brought a 10-minute rule bill, and actually there was a vote in this Parliament, and it was successful. It had the support of the House. So I think this issue has been around for some time. I don't think it's something that we're rushing to in haste.
Mr. Speaker, I pay tribute to the honourable lady. I know she had her 10-minute rule bill and she feels passionate about this issue too. The point I'm merely making is that as Northern Ireland Secretary, I'm looking at this in the context of Northern Ireland. There is a wider debate, and that is why there are members, ministers from government departments that are affected by the issue of abortion, because it is an extremely sensitive issue. There are many strongly held views across all sides of the debate, and particularly across all sides of the debate for abortion reform in Northern Ireland. Let me turn to the referendum in Ireland, which was undoubtedly a significant moment in the history of that country. And its read across to the situation in the United Kingdom has to be treated with care. On the 25th of May this year, Ireland voted to repeal the relevant article of its constitution, commonly known as the 8th Amendment, which since 1983 has given unborn fetuses and pregnant women an equal right to life. This referendum followed many years of debate and discussion in Ireland, and the process is not yet over, as now although a significant majority supported repeal, that process now needs to be debated and passed through both houses of the Irish Parliament to determine what type of reform works best for Ireland. And it's important to be clear that what we witnessed, if I can just finish this sentence, that what we witnessed in Ireland was specific to Ireland, where a change to their written constitution requires a referendum. I will, of course, give way.
Is the example in Ireland a perfect example of what this proposal is? To remove the bar, the criminal offence, and then to allow a debate in this place and in other places, in other devolved areas, of how they would like abortion to then be regulated? And is that not where we should be going and not restricting?
Oh, Mr. Speaker, that is undoubtedly what the debate is about today, whether that is the right approach. But I just want to be clear that in the Republic of Ireland, a referendum is required for constitutional change. That is not the situation in the United Kingdom, including in Northern Ireland. And I do want to be clear that there are very significant differences. We do not know what the Irish law will look like. That has to be debated. It has to be taken through both houses of the Irish Parliament. We cannot simply read across from that vote. And it was a referendum, if I could just finish this point, it was a referendum which was decided by the people of Ireland, and it's now to be taken forward by the Irish government. It is clearly a matter for the Irish, and it should not be implied that it should automatically extend to the people of Northern Ireland. Of course, I give way to the Honourable Lady, who I know has a great interest in this area.
I'm interested in her thoughts. She's of course right that the situation is very different in the Republic, but the situation is now very important across the island of Ireland, which has massive implications across Northern Ireland for what has happened. Has she spoken with the Irish government about the implications of women travelling from the north to the south and the relationship now, in the spirit of the Good Friday Belfast Agreement,
on this issue on the island of Ireland.
Yeah. Mr. Speaker, I have of course spoken to the Irish Government, as I do regularly and as I do with all parties, the main parties in Northern Ireland also. But let's be clear, this was a referendum to allow a change in the law. The law has not changed in the Republic. In Ireland, there is still a prohibition on abortion, as there was previously, and it is now for the Irish Parliament, both houses, to debate what that law should look like. And therefore, I want to make it the point that this is not a simple process, and that this takes time and needs consideration, as it will in Ireland, in the Irish Parliament. I will.
Would the Secretary of State agree that the legal effect of the repeal of sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Persons Act 1861 would be to allow terminations right up to the point of birth?
No. Well, Mr. Speaker, I think there are a number of interpretations of what it may or may not mean, but that is part of a separate debate, I would suggest. That today we are debating the matter in Northern Ireland, and I would therefore wish to return to the matter of Northern Ireland and make some progress, Mr. Speaker. Of course, I will give way to the Honourable Lady.
I think it's worth pointing out what we're talking about today is repeal of OPA across the United Kingdom. Yes. We're not talking about getting rid of the Preservation of Infant Life Act 1929, which criminalises abortion after 24 weeks. Nobody's talking about changing the time limit, either in England and Wales or imposing it in Northern Ireland. Clearly, in this debate, it's facts, not fiction, that matters.
Mr. Speaker, I will make some progress now, but I did want to hear from the Honourable Lady as the sponsor of the debate. Turning to the situation in Northern Ireland, I'm aware that there are a number of voices calling for reform, including the women and girls most affected. But what is clear to me is that there is currently no consensus on what that reform should be, even amongst those who want to see change in Northern Ireland. For example, there are those in favour of extending abortion in cases of fatal fetal abnormality or in cases of rape and incest, but others want to extend the laws that apply here to Northern Ireland. There are a number of views, and we have to consider them all respectfully. And of course, all sides in this debate should be listened to with courtesy and respect. Abortion has always been a devolved matter in Northern Ireland since Northern Ireland was created in 1921, and it would not be appropriate for Westminster to seek to impose its will or be the arbiter of this issue that has long been devolved to the people of Northern Ireland. The Government believes that the question of any future reform in Northern Ireland must also be debated and decided by the people of Northern Ireland and their locally elected and therefore accountable politicians. This is of course will.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very grateful indeed to the Secretary of State, and I've listened very, very carefully and intently to what she's had to say. She did use the phrase that change takes time, and it does. However, I would ask the Secretary of State to think very carefully about the number of women who are compelled to leave Northern Ireland, to go to Scotland, to go to England, and may, in future times, be able to go to the Republic of Ireland for an abortion. For those women who access online pills which are desperately dangerous, what is the Secretary of State saying to them? How long are we going to have to wait for change?
Well, Mr. Speaker, this House determined that we should provide support for women to travel to Great Britain to receive support, to receive abortions. Personally, I want to see reform in Northern Ireland, but it is a matter for the people of Northern Ireland. And as this is an issue that has always... I am going to make some progress, but I will hear the voice of Scotland.
This is not a Scottish-specific point. This is a point about the... This is a point about the Supreme Court, which is due to rule on Thursday. My understanding is that if the Supreme Court on Thursday rules that the situation in Northern Ireland is incompatible with the ECHR, then it will be the responsibility of the UK Government to act under Section 26 of the Northern Ireland Act, because it's the UK Government that has the responsibility to fulfil international treaty obligations. Am I correct in that understanding?
Mr. Speaker, I apologise. I realise she's not the only voice of Scotland, and that there were many other voices of Scotland we will hear today. But I'm not going to prejudge the Supreme Court Act. the Supreme Court judgment. We will receive the judgment, we believe, on Thursday, and when we have that judgment, we will carefully consider it. But if I can go back to the matter of Northern Ireland, this is a matter of conscience. A free vote on this issue in this House would be afforded if the matter of abortion comes before the House again, and the same applies in Northern Ireland. That is why, Mr. Speaker, the Government, like its predecessors, believes that the best forum to debate and resolve these and many other matters is in a locally elected Northern Ireland Assembly. So the Government's priority remains to urgently re-establish strong, inclusive, devolved government at the earliest opportunity. And as Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, I want to ensure that any future reform is handled with due care and consideration, with locally elected and locally accountable politicians having the opportunity to consider and debate the issues, and for the people of Northern Ireland to be able to contribute to the debate on the devolved issues that affect their lives. And just as only because it's the Honourable Lady, and then I will make progress.
Giving way. I agree with everything she's just said. Can she explain why she thinks repealing sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Person Act 1861 would not allow that to happen? Because we think it would.
Mr. Speaker, as I have said, that is a matter that would affect the whole of the United Kingdom, and that is a debate that therefore should be had in the whole of the United Kingdom context, looking at all of those matters. And just as we have debated in this House the laws that ought to apply here, the democratically elected Assembly in Northern Ireland must continue to consider this fundamental issue, listening to the views of the people of Northern Ireland. Or, as my right honourable friend from Basingstoke suggested, we are in danger of disenfranchising 1.8 million citizens of the United Kingdom. And so my focus is therefore, I'm sorry, I will make progress because there are many other people who want to speak, and I do want to make sure that everyone has their chance. My focus is therefore on working closely with Northern Ireland's political parties to restore the devolved government that the public wants, and that remains my top priority. And I also want to continue to hear from those in civil society on all sides of the debate, as I am deeply sympathetic to the cases being debated. Mr. Speaker, my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, has been clear in her support for women's rights in respect of access to safe abortions, and she welcomed the referendum result in Ireland. We are in agreement that the best way forward for Northern Ireland is through locally accountable politicians making important decisions through devolution, and for the people of Northern Ireland to have their say on the devolved issues which affect their daily lives. Thank you.
Tony Lloyd.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I also begin by congratulating my honourable friend for Walthamstow and those who, honourable members on all sides of the House, who sought this debate today. I'd also like to mention my honourable friend for Hull North, who's campaigned on this issue now for many years. And I, like the Secretary of State, will concentrate significantly on the situation in Northern Ireland. There is no doubt that the referendum in the Republic 10 days ago, 12 days ago, whenever, has altered not the constitutionality of the situation anywhere in the United Kingdom, and not at all in Northern Ireland, but it has most certainly changed the way the conversation is now taking place. And we have to take that into account. But, Mr. Speaker, one of the things that I think I want to establish in this debate is that, yes, whilst we will discuss the legalese of sections 58 and 9 of the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act, whilst we'll talk about the esoteric levels of human rights, not to trivialise that, actually, in the end, this is about people. It is about women like Sarah, the Honourable Member for Lagan Valley referred to, a woman who had the most immense difficulty on discovering that the baby that she was carrying would be born with no skull, could not survive that birth process, could not go on to live, who had to travel in the most difficult circumstances, having been given actually chronically bad support from the medical profession in Northern Ireland, had to travel to England for that safe and lawful abortion. That kind of case, Mr. Speaker, ought to condition the way we see this issue. It's about people, it's about women in distress. Now, I, like many members of this House, have seen the joy of happy pregnancy. In my own family, one of my daughters gave birth earlier on this year. What a great moment that is. But I've also seen the downside, the tragedy of people who know that the fetus that they conceived in hope is born to die, that the situation of women who have become pregnant as a result of rape. These things we have to take on board and recognise the humanity. And yes, I don't doubt anybody's legitimacy in putting forward the arguments that they want to pursue, but I'm absolutely determined that I state that there is a human being behind every one of these situations, and we've got to remember that as we debate these matters. Now, obviously, the other issue that I would want to just bring before the House, something that the Honourable Member for Edinburgh South West mentioned a little bit earlier on. The decision before the Supreme Court actually is going to make a profound difference. But the position of my own party has been very, very clear. The last election, our manifesto was very clear on the situation in Northern Ireland. We said we would seek to provide, in conjunction with the Northern Ireland Assembly, the legislative framework that allowed for safe, legal abortion for those women in Northern Ireland who made that choice. And that is where we want to see things happen. We want to see that legislation take place in the Stormont Assembly. But I've got to say, my honourable friend from Walthamstow said nothing that ran in contradiction to that process. This is legislation that, in actual fact, would, of course, demand change, but it gives the opportunity for the Stormont Assembly to make the legislative framework for the people, and in particular the women of Northern Ireland. That's important, but there is a challenge behind that, because I think I heard the Honourable Member for Lagan Valley say that they would go back to the Assembly without precondition. Now, I hope that's the case, because there is a real challenge now to all the Assembly politicians. You've got to get back to the Stormont Assembly. If you, yes, I'll give way just the Honourable Member to say, if you want to be taken seriously on this debate and on other issues, we cannot see, Mr. Speaker, forgive me, we cannot see a situation where civil servants make decisions. We cannot see a situation when those without an electoral mandate make decisions. But in that case, it's incumbent on the Northern Ireland Assembly members to get back to the Assembly. Of course,
very grateful to the honourable gentleman for giving way, and he's someone I hold in high esteem and have greatest respect for, and so on. The reality is he knows. He doesn't have to hope. He knows. The Democratic Unionist Party would go into government tomorrow on the basis of what we agreed previously, as would, I understand, the Ulster Unionists, the SDLP and the Alliance Party. Sinn Féin do not want to go in. They want to have preconditions. So there is no doubt about our commitment to going into government, having the Assembly up and running, debating all these issues. And we have no petition of concern veto in the Northern Ireland Assembly anymore. So these are matters, those who shout hardest about wanting this issue resolved should get the Assembly up and running. We agree with that. Get on with it.
Mr. Speaker, I wasn't quite sure whether the no precondition of his honourable friend has just been undermined by the honourable member. But nevertheless, let's say this. I think in that sense it would be very helpful if the Secretary of State would now be saying to all the parties in the Assembly, get round the table with the Secretary of State, let's see this issue of law reform around abortion, one that's on the table as part of it. If this matters, then it must transcend some of the other issues that have caused blockage in the recent past. And that is a challenge, I know, to members from Northern Ireland, both in this Westminster Parliament as well as in the Northern Ireland Assembly. But it's a challenge that politicians have to take up. We've got to see the Assembly up and running, and that's absolutely fundamental. But I would say as well, Mr. Speaker, there is, I mentioned before the case that lies before the Supreme Court, and the Honourable Member for Edinburgh South West was absolutely right in the question she posed to the Secretary of State, because, of course, that case that lies before the Supreme Court, I can't anticipate how they will respond to the case, but what the case turns on is the situation as to whether it is compatible with our Charter obligations under the Convention obligations under the Convention of Human Rights for there to be no access for women who are bearing children as a result of rape, incest, or with fatal fetal abnormality or extreme malformation of the fetus to obtain that legal, safe abortion in Northern Ireland. If the Supreme Court does resolve that, The incompatibility of our law won't be about Northern Ireland, it will be about the United Kingdom. Now, I must say to the Secretary of State, if the Supreme Court does make the decision in that one direction, I think she and her colleagues in Cabinet will now have to take very serious consideration as to why and how we could not begin to address that at the Westminster level. It would be a Westminster issue, not a Stormont issue. And I think that needs to be of course, a good way.
I thank the Shadow Secretary of State for giving way on that point. But does it not actually identify a huge flaw in this entire debate? 98% of all abortions carried out in the United Kingdom are carried out on pregnancies that could continue to full term. They're not inconvenient, they're not fatal abnormality cases, they're not cases as a result of crisis pregnancies, they're unwanted pregnancies. And the matter that he is now saying should be introduced to Northern Ireland is not about the minority and difficult cases, but it's about opening up termination of life to all.
Absolutely.
And that is the fatal flaw in his argument, because it's something that is rejected out of hand by all of the parties in Northern Ireland.
I'm sorry, I do have to say to the honourable member that he wasn't listening to anything I've said. What I've said was, I think, has been very clear, that in the case of the Westminster Parliament having to respond to the Supreme Court, that is in a very limited and restricted number of cases, very, very clearly defined. I also said that it would be incumbent upon the Stormont that it would be incumbent on the Stormont Assembly to legislate for the situation in Northern Ireland, and in that case, it would be up to the Assembly to decide the limitations on the law and the impact of the law in Northern Ireland. Of course, good way.
From the gentleman for giving way. He's making a very powerful speech. I agree with much of what he says. Would he agree with me? It's also very important, especially in relation to the comment that's just been made from my right honourable friend over there, not to forget that this is actually about the right of a woman to choose. It is not just confined to those who have fetal abnormalities or may have been raped or in some ghastly incestuous relationship. This is about women's rights and our right to control what we do with our bodies.
Well, and I obviously I do agree, and let me make it very clear that my voting record is clear on this issue. I will briefly.
I felt you were maybe the gentleman was going to say something about convenient, abortions being convenient. I worked in those clinics and I counselled those women. And can I tell you, they are not done for convenience. Some of those people are utterly desperate by the time they get to those clinics. And it would be really wrong to think that people treat it as a matter of convenience.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend because, of course, she's right. She's absolutely right on this. This isn't a matter of convenience. The heart-rending decision that I know that many women that I've spoken to over the years, many of the women I've represented, but many people I've known in different ways who have to go through the agonising decision as to whether abortion is the right choice for them, nevertheless should lie with them and certainly should not lie with laws that restrict that capacity. But nevertheless, the point I would still want to emphasise, Mr Speaker, is that what we're saying is that, and what my honourable friend for Walthamstow is saying, is that we want to see, it is the position of the Labour Party, we are the Good Friday Party, we believe. It is our position. We want to see devolved government work, but politicians in Northern Ireland have got to make it work on this issue. They cannot shy away from it. If this issue matters to the people they represent, then they have to be in the Assembly making the laws for the people of Northern Ireland. Mr Speaker, there are many people who want to speak, and I don't intend to prolong it too much longer, except simply I want to conclude as I began. You know, this isn't, in the end, an issue about lawyers. It's not an issue about even the philosophy of abortion. It is really about real people. It's about real women, very often in situations of distress, very often who are looking for the law to allow them to pursue something that at the moment, in the case of Northern Ireland, is prevented. That ought to be unconscionable. It ought to be unconscionable that a woman who is bearing a child doomed to die is made to continue to carry on that child. It ought to be unconscionable that a woman who who provides, as we one case that does exist, who provided a 15-year-old daughter with the capacity to terminate a pregnancy, is now still facing criminal prosecution. In that basis, humanity cries out now for a change in the law. So I want once again to congratulate my honourable friend for Walthamstow. This is a really important debate. It isn't a concluding debate. This will simply, even in going, it will cannot be passed today. Even if we passed legislation to make the words of the motion before us into law, it would still need other legal change, both UK-wide and most definitely in Northern Ireland. It is devolution compatible. Politicians in Northern Ireland now must make that devolution work.
Thank you. Order. I fear the 6-minute limit on backbench speeches won't last much longer, to judge by how things are going. Dr. Sarah Wollaston.
Mr. Speaker, could I start by paying tribute to the honourable member from Walthamstow for all the work that she has undertaken in this area and for bringing this debate to the House. I believe that the result of the referendum in the Republic of Ireland has been a great victory for women's rights to make decisions about their own bodies. But it has also thrown a stark spotlight on the situation for women in Northern Ireland. It cannot, in my mind, be acceptable that in just 6 counties of this, our United Kingdom, women are forced to make long journeys, long lonely journeys across the water, or be forced into the hands of the unscrupulous and face criminal prosecutions for making decisions that should be theirs by right. And I do believe that it is time for this House to act to protect their rights, as well as the rights for everywhere else in the United Kingdom. Of course.
I very much thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. And we heard earlier from the Honourable Member for Lagan Valley about the devolution of policing issues to Northern Ireland. And I would say to the Honourable Lady, does she agree that that is part of the whole issue that is at problem here? That we are talking about policing women's bodies, and that is not the right context for this debate. This is a health matter, a medical matter, to support women making those decisions, because no woman takes this decision lightly.
Indeed, I couldn't agree with the Honourable Lady more. It is time for us to review the way that we treat this issue and to move to a medical model. Since the 1967 Act, things have changed very considerably, not just in social attitudes, but in the availability of medicines and medical terminations of pregnancy. That wasn't available at the time. We've also moved on from the very paternalistic attitudes that dictated that only 2 doctors could be trusted to help a woman make these decisions. It completely negates the role that we now have as specialist nurse practitioners in practice who undertake the role of counselling, very often within these clinics. So it's an anachronism that we still insist on 2 medical signatures.
Thank the Honourable Lady for giving way on the matter of paternalism. Does she agree with me that comments about women having abortions as a matter of convenience are deeply offensive, and that this debate must be characterised by decency and respect? There are views across the House, but as someone who has had friends and who has supported friends who have had an abortion, nothing in what they have done or chosen to do has been about convenience.
Thank the Honourable Lady for her points, and if the House will forgive me, I'm mindful that many members wish to speak, so I won't take further interventions. But I think there's another point to make about the impact of medical terminations of pregnancy using 2 medicines. And the second of those medicines, because of the restrictions of the Act, because that currently has to be administered within the clinic, it means that women are sometimes having to face the extreme indignity of travelling home with heavy bleeding and considerable pain. It should be time for us as a House to review the way the whole of this operates and to shift to a medical model. And what I'd say to ministers is that we know that there is an opportunity to put this right with an amendment during the course of the domestic violence bill. But now is the time to plan ahead for that, not to actually look the other way and to say that this is purely a devolved matter. We know that a cross-party amendment will be brought. So this is the time now to be planning ahead to look at the kind of thoughtful and careful preparations that we need to make about what the kind of medical regulations we would wish to see in place. Now, of course, there are those that say that by repealing sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Person Act, we'll be thrown into some kind of vacuum. I'm afraid that isn't the case, as the Honourable Lady opposite has already pointed out, that the term limit of 24 weeks would remain in place. But what I would say is that there are other protections there. It is already, for example, an offence to supply abortion pills under the Human Medicines Regulation Act of 2012, for example. And individuals face up to 2 years in prison and a considerable fine for supplying them in an illegal manner. Equally, for those who might turn to backstreet abortionists and have an unqualified person carry out a surgical procedure, which is what has happened in the past, we know that has happened, those who say that actually it means that there could be a free-for-all and anyone performing these kinds of procedures, well, no, that isn't the case. This would still constitute actual bodily harm, grievous bodily harm, and they wouldn't be able to rely on the victim's the consent to the procedure as a defence under Section 47 and Section 20 of the Offences Against the Person Act, which would remain in place. And this would carry a penalty of up to 5 years imprisonment and a fine. But I think the point to make here is that it's highly unlikely that anyone would want to visit a backstreet abortionist in a context where free, safe, confidential and non-stigmatising help was available free of charge on the NHS. And as many colleagues have pointed out, we don't stop abortions taking place by criminalising them and making them difficult to access. We just make them happen in a less safe context. So, as I would say to the Minister is, could I ask that they actually now start a process of preparing ahead for the inevitable cross-party amendments that are going to come forward? I hope that the Minister, in summing up, will be absolutely clear that there will be no delay to bringing forward the domestic violence bill for fear of a controversial amendment, because the amendment will be laid. But now is the time to make sure that all the regulations that we need are carefully and thoughtfully consulted upon. As my honourable friend has mentioned, it would allow devolved assemblies to also themselves decide on what was right for their areas. But I think to move now, the time is absolutely right for us to move from a situation where women are criminalised to one where women are treated with respect and dignity. I'm going to take one further intervention from my honourable colleague, the Chair of the Home Affairs Committee.
I welcome the speech that the Chair of the Health Select Committee is making, and her point that this is the opportunity to prepare and to consider these things in some detail in anticipation of future legislation. And would she agree that the moving thing about the home to vote movement in the Irish referendum, in the Republic referendum campaign, was that there were so many women who said they were returning home to vote so that other women didn't have to travel in future and making journeys to prevent other women having to do so?
I absolutely agree. I think we were all deeply moved by the Home to Vote campaign. And I think that, as I say, although this was in the context of the Republic of Ireland, it of course has implications for us here across the whole of the United Kingdom, because it has given us an opportunity to review what is wrong with the existing legislation. And as I say, I feel it is time for the government now to plan ahead, to have a thoughtful process of making sure that the regulations are right, and I hope that this House will decide collectively to protect and respect the rights of women wherever they live in this United Kingdom.
Deirdre Brock.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In the aftermath of the vote in Ireland, there was a quote I saw from a woman in Northern Ireland, which was to the effect that she had the right to hold the passports of both UK and Ireland, to be a citizen of either or both, but she now didn't have the right to choose that women in either jurisdiction have. That quote was third or fourth hand by the time I saw it, but it seems to me an indicator of where many women in Northern Ireland find themselves stranded. perhaps might be the best description of how they see their plight. Their plight is my plight, and their fight is my fight, and if they suffer, I suffer too. I stand with the women who feel themselves shorn of the rights that they see across the border in Ireland and across the Irish Sea. I wonder, though, why this should be seen as an emergency debate. The referendum in Ireland didn't change the conditions in Northern Ireland. Nothing has changed for women in Northern Ireland in terms of access to health services, except that they now have another geographically close comparison. Nothing has improved for them, nothing happily has got worse for them, but nothing has changed for them, more's the pity. Yes, this is a very sensitive issue. I think our sisters, therefore, deserve a little more consideration than a rushed debate. Who here, other than members who serve constituencies on the other side of the sea, has any real perception of the issues and possible consequences surrounding abortion in Northern Ireland? Now, I stand with my sisters in Northern Ireland and I absolutely endorse their right to choose, but I do not claim to know their situation better than they do. I endorse their right to help shape the legislation they live under, but it is not for me or anyone else in here to tell them how to do that. Support I can offer, encouragement I will give. Legislation has to be with the agreement of the people. Government is only with the consent of the people. Now, I hear those who say this is a human rights issue. I agree. And that is why we must leave the judgment on that in the hands of the Supreme Court. That court has a duty to examine the reference from the Court of Appeal in Northern Ireland and will give guidance that must be followed. As we know, the judgment will be handed down on Thursday. We have 2 days to wait. Before I move on, I really think a little look at how Ireland approached amending its constitution would be very instructive for many in this chamber and indeed the one next door. Ireland's movement to allowing abortion to be legislated for, as has been pointed out already, that being the substance of the constitutional amendment, began with a citizens' assembly. So it was the people who had their hands on the tiller. This was no political campaign or activist-led agitation. This was people power from the start. And it should be a subject lesson for anyone who wants to effect major change. The details of the Assembly are online at citizensassembly.ie, and I would recommend a read to anyone who would like to think a little more about how nations should change direction. So Ireland is now free, as we've heard, to choose whether to legislate to allow terminations, and I understand there is legislation being drafted now. Ireland does not yet have that law in place, and the debate, as the Secretary of State mentioned, is just getting started. I note that the Taoiseach has indicated that allowing women from Northern Ireland to access those services across the border is being considered. He points out that women from Northern Ireland regularly access other health services in Ireland, and there should be no reason why any new services should be denied them. We should not, however, be thinking that Ireland's legislation is done and dusted. The drafting is not complete yet, never mind the passage of the legislation. But that legislative progression is a matter for Ireland, for the Irish people, and for the people they have elected to serve them. Likewise, the issue of abortion in Northern Ireland is a devolved matter, and it is an issue for the people of Northern Ireland and the people they elect to the Assembly. It is a matter devolved, and frankly, it matters not a jot whether the decisions made at Stormont, when it's sitting, are agreeable to members who sit here. That is the point of devolution, a point that some members of this place have been spectacularly slow to appreciate at times. That decisions in devolved administrations are taken there for reasons that people in those devolved nations understand from their point of view, and using evidence that the people and politicians and policymakers of that nation consider important. That principle stands, and it can be seen in the ways in which Scotland has led on public health issues.
Thank you, Honourable Member, for giving way. In order to allow the residents of Northern Ireland to craft their own abortion laws, and so for that devolution process to be respected that she's outlined, will she be joining myself and colleagues across the House in supporting the repeal of UK legislation that prevents Northern Ireland. So will she support repealing 58 and 59? It'd be helpful if she could be clear about that.
The points. Firstly, that OPA does not apply in Scotland, so some people seem to not be aware of that. Also, I understand that Stormont has been able to repeal those clauses itself since 2010 and apparently has chosen not to do so.
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Just to clarify on that point, I think what's being missed here today is that criminal justice is a devolved matter in Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland Assembly has full power to repeal this. In due course, if that is the decision of the Northern Ireland Assembly, in line with the new regulations that are put in place, this occurred under the Offences of the Person Act does not act as a barrier. That can be done in the Northern Ireland Assembly with the will of the people.
I thank the honourable member for her contribution. I would also point out that the Criminal Justice Act 1945 still prevents abortion. That's the Northern Ireland Act. Life in prison is offered for those offering abortions as well. So, that is an added complication. As we know, Stormont hasn't sat since January of last year, and Can I absolutely, Mr. Speaker, condemn the cowardice of the politicians who cannot give enough ground or cannot risk losing a little face to get the show back on the road and start deciding on issues that affect the people they are paid to serve. I say that because this issue has been considered at Stormont, as we've heard. The need for legislation has been agreed at Stormont, and a way forward has been laid out, as mentioned by the Right Honourable Member for Basingstoke, no longer in her place. A way forward has been laid out by a working group in Northern Ireland. In a debate on consideration of a Justice Bill in February of 2016, amendments were laid which would have allowed abortions to take place in Northern Ireland in very specific circumstances, tighter than the conditions that are in place under the 1967 Act. That is absolutely true, but a movement nonetheless. And it followed, I believe, a deal of public consultation undertaken by ministers surrounding the issues of fatal fetal abnormality, incest and rape. Now, it is clear, and from what has already been said today, that from reading the transcript of that debate, that there wasn't exactly a consensus that day. The amendments were defeated, not overwhelmingly, but substantially. And one of the telling contributions that day was made by the Assembly member for South Belfast, who is now the Honourable Member here for Belfast South. In her speech that day, she said she was speaking on behalf of the Democratic Unionist Party on the issue, and she urged the Assembly to reject the amendments in favour of the DUP plan. So if I may quote her, the DUP is rejecting the amendment but outlining a roadmap to a sensible, informed and appropriate way forward. The Ministry of Health has been asked to establish by the end of February a working group that will include clinicians in this field and legally qualified persons to make recommendations on how this issue should be addressed. Can be addressed, including, if necessary, bringing forward draft legislation. We have asked that all interested parties should be consulted and that the group will be tasked to report within 6 months. We all need to hear more fully the views of the Royal College and others. We all need the opportunity to ask these vital questions to get the appropriate advice. That is why the working group is the best and most appropriate way forward. Now, that working group has now reported, and since the DUP is behind it, it surely has enough impetus to clear the hurdles of political impasse in Northern Ireland. The report recommended a relaxation of the restrictions on abortion, citing the general duty of the Department of Health under the Health and Personal Care Social Services Order 1972 to secure improvement in the physical and mental health of people living in Northern Ireland. The report pointed out, however, that legislative change is required for that to be done. The report is clear that the current practice results in inequality of outcomes for women in this particular patient population group when compared to the standards for treatment and care afforded to other pregnant women by Health and Social Care, as required by the Department of Health's maternity strategy, and it recommends changes in the law to allow abortions to take place. Now, the changes suggested would not go as far as the legislation here or in Scotland. Examining that wasn't the remit of the working group. It was only examining what legislative change was needed. The changes wouldn't bring legislation into line with the rights and protections we have here, and it wouldn't be the end of women having the trauma of travel to a foreign jurisdiction for health treatment. The changes would not be the changes I would like, but they are the changes which the politicians of Stormont agreed to support. We have an obligation to respect the fact that the debate on abortion has not perhaps yet been won in Northern Ireland, But this small step can be taken while the debate continues. Now, Stormont should be reconvened. It should consider legislation around abortion along with all the other responsibilities it has, but it is a devolved responsibility. Legislating here on a matter which is the responsibility of a devolved administration is invidious. And the idea that members sitting here can make decisions without any regard to the consequences is foolhardy. The Stormont has not sat for far too long, and that looks set to continue. A disgraceful abdication of responsibility on the part of elected members. Now, it isn't sitting, but it has made this decision, and there is no reason why this place shouldn't legislate to put that decision into effect. Stormont could always decide how to proceed when MLAs return to work. Legislating here for abortion in Northern Ireland without the consent of the legislature of Northern Ireland is not tenable, but consent has already been given for some change, and we should implement that. We should press ahead and deliver. And then a comprehensive review of the legislation can proceed, with the people who will be affected being front and centre. The rights of women are too often ignored and women belittled. There is a moral obligation on the politicians of Northern Ireland to get back to work, engage with the people and move on. They can look to Dublin's example for a way to start.
Hear, hear.
There are decisions to be made, hopefully leading to a full and proper health service for women, but I would argue it is not our decision. Legislate to put into effect the changes which have been decided by all means, but we shouldn't make decisions here which should more properly be made in Belfast. I stand by the women of Northern Ireland. I stand with those who campaign for a full service, including a proper abortion service. They should be able to influence those decisions and have them made in their own legislature. The conceit is too often that this place knows best, but the reimposition of direct rule on Northern Ireland is in no one's best interest, let alone the women who need support and a decent health service. The DUP supports the change in the law that was agreed by Stormont. Let's help them deliver it.
I'm afraid, with immediate effect, a 5-minute limit on backbench speeches now applies. Justine Greening.
Mr. Speaker, I think, like many members of this House, I recognise just how important a debate the House is having today on an incredibly sensitive and important topic of abortion. It's obvious that there needs to be much broader debate around the various issues in relation to abortion, not just in terms of the people who are affected by the laws we currently have in place and some of the proposals that we're debating today, but also the role of schools, advice, education, support, and some of the other hugely controversial but important issues that wrap around the broader challenge of debating any changes to abortion, not just in Northern Ireland, but more broadly across the United Kingdom. I recognise that we have very long-standing laws in place in relation to England in particular, and I think in all of this debate we should not lose sight of the fact that what has brought us here today is a clear anomaly between the rights that women have across the rest of the United Kingdom compared to the rights that they now have in one part of our country, which is Northern Ireland, and that difference being exacerbated now by the referendum result that happened in Southern Ireland, which means that really we now see Northern Ireland as an outlier on women's rights in a way that I feel is now unsustainable for our United Kingdom. I'd like to pay tribute to the member for Walthamstow for achieving the emergency debate today. I think it is important that we have it in this chamber. And I think as she would recognise, although in this chamber we have managed to achieve progress for women in Northern Ireland, not least bringing in an ability for them to travel to the UK, travel to England in particular, and to have free abortions in the same way that any English woman would have. That is true progress, but we now today see to talk about how we can further push forward on rights for women in Northern Ireland. I think the question is how to do that. I should say, Mr Speaker, that I am open-minded to the debate that we're having today. I very much recognise that ideally we'd all like this to be something that the people of Northern Ireland themselves could put in place, but I think we also recognise the absence of an assembly and devolved government functioning normally in Northern Ireland as it stands. Clearly we'll have further debate, I'm sure, after today's debate on how we can achieve change for women of Northern Ireland, but I do think that handling this the right way in relation to devolution does matter, and I think we should as a House be sensitive to that. Whilst I'm open-minded to the broader changes that are being debated here, I think we also need to recognise that they are somewhat complex, multifaceted, and need to be understood fully, I think, by members across this House and indeed by our local communities as well. I think it's important to set out how wide, or indeed otherwise, as has been argued here today, any changes in medical regulation might need to be, and also the process of consulting with our own communities about changes that would affect how abortion is regulated in the United Kingdom, although I should say I recognise the very important case that the member for Walthamstow has made, and indeed the member for Basingstoke also set out very carefully and clearly the impact on women in Northern Ireland and indeed across the United Kingdom, given the existing situation of criminalisation of abortion. I support a continued debate in this House. I recognise that many other members want a chance to speak today. I think it is important that in the coming weeks and months, government ministers very carefully listen to the debate that happens in this House and then clearly set out the government's view on how it can play its role in helping us take forward change for the women of Northern Ireland. Take one amendment.
I thank the Right Honourable Lady for giving me, Mr Speaker. And does she agree with me that respect and dignity in this is extremely important, but that we must remember that some women in these islands are governed by legislation that's 150 years old, that there's nobody left alive that could even remember that, and that is something we have to consider.
All very clear about the way in which the existing laws, long-standing as they may be, work today, both in terms of the ability of women to have choice in our United Kingdom, but also the backdrop of a criminalisation of abortion, which I think is hard for anyone to truly defend in this House as a principle. I want us to have a measured debate, and as I was about to finish in saying, Mr Speaker, I do think it's important that over the coming weeks and months, government ministers clearly set out how they plan to respond to what is a crucial debate for women's rights that will be taking place in this House.
From West.
Mr Speaker, for a very long time in many societies and many cultures, the state and organised religion have had a stranglehold over the lives of women, and that's why it was so pleasing to see the landslide vote to repeal the 8th Amendment in the Republic of Ireland. And women in Northern Ireland will soon be the only women in the UK and Ireland who cannot gain safe access to abortion. We know that hundreds of women in Northern Ireland either travel or take risks with their own health to have a termination. And now we cannot stand by here while women and girls in any part of the UK or a part of the UK, women are criminalised or put at risk for accessing basic health care. Of course.
I'm very grateful, Honourable Lady, for giving me. She alluded there to the stranglehold that the state can have over people's lives, and one of the biggest stranglehold that the state currently has in the UK over people's lives is the reprehensible two-child policy, which should be changing to make sure that when people have more than 2 children, they do indeed have the children's allowance to help and support them with those children.
He makes a good point, and certainly I was in the lobbies at the time when we failed to support that particular point. But it is high time that the House took action to end the treatment of Northern Irish women as second-class citizens. Let's look back at the man, Leo Varadkar, who welcomed the resounding yes vote by saying that Ireland will no longer say to women, take the boat or take the plane when they need an abortion. Instead, he said, Ireland will say, take our hand. And isn't it now time for us to offer our hand to the women of Northern Ireland to end the ban on abortion in Northern Ireland?
I thank the honourable member for giving way. Does the member recognise that, in fact, she has been inaccurate in relation to that statement, in the sense that there is access to abortion in Northern Ireland? There is abortion in Northern Ireland, but on more restrictive grounds. So, for example, for the health of the mother. So what she is indicating in terms of no access to termination is not accurate.
I think it's the word restriction that I have a problem with, and I could almost choke when I say it, because we know that in February this year, the United Nations Committee to End All Forms of Discrimination Against Women stated that citizens of the UK resident in Northern Ireland face grave and systematic violations of rights due to the criminalisation of abortion. And the report explicitly called for sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Persons Act 1861 to be repealed. And I would hope that in the summing up we can hear more substance from the Minister as to a way forward, so that we can both respect devolution but also respect fundamental human rights of every single woman in the British Isles. Finally, Mr Speaker, and I'm very aware that there are so many people who wish to speak, so I'm going to keep my remarks short. But what I wanted just finally to say was I was so pleased to hear the chairwoman of the Health Select Committee mention the Domestic Violence Bill and see her already thinking ahead, because we live in such interesting times in this Parliament. And I too wish to encourage the government to think ahead, not just on the day before suddenly to realise that there might be a problem with the legislation, but to look genuinely at the issue of women's health and to think about whether the DV bill is the fitting opportunity for the House to act to remove the impediment to decriminalisation of abortion. And the government will indeed bring forward the long-awaited domestic abuse bill. And please, government, do not delay or put this aside, because it is a question of fundamental human rights, because we want this Parliament to have a vote and to put the rights of women at the forefront of all of our thoughts now. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
I should just say, for the benefit of the House and for those attending to our proceedings, that in this Standing Order number 24 debate, there is no ministerial or other front-bench wind-up speech. The front-bench speeches have been made, and that's where things stand. Fiona Bruce.
Mr Speaker, at the heart of this debate are women placed in what is often the most difficult situation of their lives. And it is important that whenever we discuss this issue, we do so with as much compassion and understanding for them as possible. And with that in mind, I endeavour to contribute to this debate without any animosity for those who I know hold distinctly different views from my own pro-life views, in which I believe that the unborn child has an equal place in this debate to be considered too. But I also believe it's vital that we endeavour to debate in an atmosphere of courtesy and respect. The Honourable Member for Walthamstow said yesterday in this House, in applying for the debate, it is little wonder that the United Nations has said we must act. That's a very powerful statement. Now, if she's based it on an inquiry report of February this year of a UN committee, I'd like to make some comments on that. I'm sure that following the debate she could clarify if there is more authority, but that committee was considering the Convention on Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW. Now, the committee's inquiry report has been cited by campaigners as one of the main justifications for reviewing Northern Irish abortion law. Yet, as I understand it, that committee doesn't have any capacity or standing to give a binding adjudication on the UK's obligations under that convention. Nor does it have any authority to interpret that convention. That is something reserved to the International Court of Justice. And so an invitation to the Home Secretary to treat that report as authoritative is, I understand, and I'm quoting the opinion of Mark Hill QC, flawed. It's also interesting to note that, if I've read it correctly, the UK government has commented on this report too and said in one of its concluding paragraphs, after reviewing the report and pointing out several factual inaccuracies in it, that for the reasons outlined above, the UK government does not accept that women from Northern Ireland have been subject to grave and systematic violations of their rights under the Convention, and concludes, I quote, "The committee's findings and recommendations which focus on changes to the criminal law on abortion cannot be addressed in the absence of a legislature with authority to legislate on such matters in Northern Ireland." And I invite the Minister to consider this, or the ministers who will consider this. I'm sure they're already aware of that statement, but it is something I profoundly disagree with as disrespectful to the people of Northern Ireland on such a sensitive issue that this Parliament should consider changing laws which would affect abortion. Abortion which has been a transferred matter, as have health and social services, equal opportunities and justice. So I turn now to another comment made by the Honourable Member for Walthamstow in her opening remarks, which related to the Infant Life Preservation Act 1929. And I would ask ministers if they would look into this and obtain legal opinion for the House, because it's a very important issue. As I understand it, and this issue is complex, the Infant Life Preservation Act 1929 and the Abortion Act were decoupled in the 1990s by the Human Fertilisation and Embryology Act. And this means that those two acts bear no relation to one another anymore, so that the Abortion Act's safeguards would in fact be removed if the OAPA sections are repealed as proposed by the proposers of this debate. And as I say, it is such a complex issue, and that's the advice I've had, that I think it is worthwhile asking ministers to look into this very carefully. Because the campaigners, the proposers of this debate, clearly want to go further. They want to decriminalise our legislation, to remove the safeguards that have been in place. Already we have some of the most liberal abortion laws in the world, and yet campaigners want to, I believe, liberalise them further. Anna Farady, Chief Executive of BPAS, has said, "I want to be very clear, there should be no legal upper limit. Colleagues should be under no illusions. Repealing these sections of the OAPA would effectively pave the way to review comprehensively our current abortion legislation, not just for Northern Ireland, but also for England and Wales. We could see abortion on demand throughout pregnancy. That would be wrong, and we should resist it."
4 minute limit now applies. I'm trying to incorporate everybody. That's the rationale. Tracy Brabin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I thank the Honourable Member for Walthamstow for bringing this debate, and the Honourable Member for Hull North for her campaigning around this subject. I'd also like to take this moment to thank the members from the opposite benches, men and women, who stood yesterday to show their support. During my short time in this place, one of my favourite roles was as a member of the Women and Equality Select Committee. There we discussed on many occasions the right of a woman to choose, resisting the criminalisation of women wherever they lived for taking control of their destinies and bodies. Working with the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, the World Health Organization and other organisations, many countries and governments around the world, we encourage them to trust women with their bodies, encourage governments to listen to women, and I believe Northern Ireland is the last piece in that global jigsaw. The United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Discrimination against Women found abortion law in Northern Ireland constitutes grave and systematic violation of the rights of our rights, recommending that UK government decriminalise abortion in the UK. It cannot be right to criminalise a woman for wanting an abortion for any of the myriad and complex reasons when women choose the right to say, "I can't have this child." Repeal Section 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Persons Act 1861, and Stormont and the people of Northern Ireland can make their own decisions. The time is right. The Republic of Ireland has shown the way. All those Irish women and men from far-flung places around the world descending on the Republic to demand change for themselves, their sisters, daughters and mothers. I, like many in this House, felt proud to watch those scenes. I believed it enhanced the global reputation of the Republic as a modern, progressive country determined to put women's rights over her body front and centre of their political conversation. The world is changing. We've got to keep pace. Me Too, the new transparency around the gender pay gap, this transformation in Ireland, women's voices are being heard, and it is time that we listen. Now, I've no doubt there are people in Northern Ireland watching this debate desperate to have a chance to engage and to have this conversation, like members of Belfast City Council, who in 2018 passed a motion stating abortion is a health issue, not a criminal issue. And the only political party who opposed the motion was the DUP. I believe resistance against this repeal is a decision of political cynicism. It's cruel and controlling and lacking humanity. We all loved and also was terrified by the last series and this new one of Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale. Don't let women from the Northern Ireland look back on this moment and say that's when the government turned back the clock, held us back, ignored our human rights, treated us like criminals because we wanted the power to make our own decision about whether and when we have children. It's time. We must do the right thing.
Thank you. Anna Soubry.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to say that for as long as I can remember, probably after the 67 Act was first passed, I've been a proud supporter of it, and I remember in the 70s and the 80s marching many a mile in defence of the 67 Act, and my views haven't changed. And I think the reason that I came to that conclusion, that it was one of the greatest pieces of legislation ever passed in this place, was as follows, and have already been identified not just by the honourable member who's just spoken, but also the honourable member for Totnes. You see, it's simply this, Mr. Speaker. I recognise that for a myriad of reasons, a woman or a young woman may find herself in a position with an unwanted pregnancy, and I believe that she has a right to choose what happens next. You see, I gently say to the honourable member for Congleton, I don't seek to impose my views on anybody. I seek to offer a choice. That is the point, and that is the distinction. Because I'd say to honourable members sitting over on the benches occupied by the DUP, with respect, you impose your views on other women. Actually, not just women, but their extended families. You see, I won't take any interventions because the Speaker's been quite firm with me, and I'm keen to curry favour with the Speaker. It would make a change. But there's an important point to make. You see, nobody happily, willingly skips into a clinic to terminate a pregnancy, and invariably they do so after a heart-rending, thoughtful process, often with a partner, a boyfriend, often even their own parents. And it's recognising that reality. And as the honourable member for Totnes said, the reality is, if you make abortions illegal, they don't stop. Honourable members know that from the evidence within Northern Ireland. 724 go overseas to have those terminations. And before the 67 Act was passed, Mr. Speaker, women, living, breathing human beings, died in their hundreds of thousands at the hands of the backstreet abortionists, or found themselves in a position where they were harmed and damaged and could never again have the child that they often longed for, but at a time that suited them and their circumstances. So that's what the 67 Act was all about. And those rights should now be extended to Northern Ireland. You know, it's 2018, and I would gently say your laws are cruel, repressive, they do nothing for the advancement of women or for families, and they have to change. But the beauty of what the honourable member for Walthamstow, and I congratulate her, is suggesting, actually not only delivers exactly the thing that should happen, as the honourable member for Hull North eloquently and properly advocated in her 10-minute rule, that we should get rid of these ridiculous laws, these ancient laws almost, actually criminalise abortion. This is the right thing to do. Let's get rid of them. And the beauty in doing that is actually it then strengthens devolution, because the responsibility then for sorting out what happens in Northern Ireland will go back to the Northern Ireland Assembly. Now, I thought I was going to stand up and make a speech about the importance of devolution, Mr. Speaker. I thought I was going to stand up and talk about why it wasn't the job of this Parliament to do what the Honourable Lady is suggesting, but actually she's convinced me. She's absolutely right. One, it delivers the right thing in advancing our abortion legislation, and secondly, it strengthens devolution because it hands it straight back where it should be with the Northern Ireland Assembly. And I gently say to them, get it sorted out, because this will not be tolerable any longer in our nation. We are a united kingdom. We believe in the union. Get that assembly up and running. Do the right thing, not just by the people and the women in particular of Northern Ireland, but for the security and for the furtherance of this great union.
Tonia Antoniazzi.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I take this opportunity to congratulate my honourable friend for Walthamstow for securing this emergency debate. And yesterday, I was proud to stand with members from across this House in solidarity to bring the debate forward. But what stuns me is that this government does and will pander further to the DUP to force their agenda through this House, particularly, no doubt, next week, selling off the rights of women in Northern Ireland down the river. Women are suffering and their human rights are being infringed, while this House doesn't act because the Northern Ireland Assembly has not sat since January 2017, and that shows little sign of being reconstituted. Shame on the Tories, shame on the DUP, and shame on politicians who stand in its way. Because I have met with different groups from across Northern Ireland, and many say they are not interested in politics. One of the expressions used to me is that they were politically agnostic. Well, what does that say about politics in Northern Ireland? They are turning people off politics and making their own way in life. People are making their own way in life in Northern Ireland, despite the shambles around the power-sharing discussions. Unfortunately, I am unable to. But in the absence of a Northern Ireland Assembly, Westminster has a duty to stand up for the women of Northern Ireland. However, isn't it waiting for the Assembly to act? Isn't waiting for the Assembly to act to uphold the rights of women in Northern Ireland a way of avoiding taking action altogether? Now, the rollout of universal credit, as we have all heard previously, penalises women who decide to have a third child, even if that is a result of rape or within an abusive relationship. Imagine not being able to afford having a third child. Imagine having to make the agonising decision on continuing pregnancy where fetal abnormalities have been detected. And how can any of us begin to imagine what it is like to have to make that decision? It's ironic, really, how the DUP can morally support the government on that two-child rule. Now, my honourable friend for Pontypridd, in his former role, wrote to the DPP in Northern Ireland about this very issue, and they made it very clear it is a potential offence to withhold information regarding an act of rape. The legislation does not distinguish between a victim and third parties to whom a disclosure is made. Each is potentially liable to prosecution. Isn't it evident then that women in Northern Ireland are getting the rough end of the stick? And this is also about the 1861 Offences Against the Person Act being archaic and Victorian. So, it is my responsibility as a woman and as a Member of Parliament to defend the rights of women in Northern Ireland. While abortion law may be devolved to Stormont, human rights are not, and the UN has told the government on more than one occasion that the rights of women in Northern Ireland are being violated. Moreover, the defence of these rights is the responsibility of every MP in the United Kingdom. This is about the rights of women to do what they want with their bodies, about choice, which we have spoken about today in the Chamber. This is about giving women in Northern Ireland parity with their sisters in the United Kingdom and now over the border in Ireland. This is about leading the way on women's rights around the world. This is about fairness and justice. But more than anything, this is a crazy situation to be in 2018. And I will be doing everything I can to stand up for the women in Northern Ireland. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Maria Caulfield.
Mr. Speaker.
This is a hugely sensitive issue, and it's fundamentally a debate, or should be, about women's choice over abortion in Northern Ireland. And that's why I find it incredible that the honourable member for Walthamstow, the one thing she doesn't ask for is for women in Northern Ireland to have a vote and a say on whether they actually want abortion in Northern Ireland. Yet in her interviews on Sunday, when talking about Brexit, it was clear that she was campaigning for a second referendum, a people's vote, on whether Brexit should actually happen. Surely abortion for women in Northern Ireland is more of a key issue to fight for a referendum than that of a second referendum on Brexit. But what it shows today is that this issue, and we've heard it from many speakers, is actually a Trojan horse for what is really wanted, which is removing sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Persons Act, which would introduce abortion on demand for any reason up to 24 weeks. And that's crucially what this debate is really about. And it's disrespectful to women in Northern Ireland to pretend it is about anything else. And especially in the year of suffrage, because while we celebrate 100 years of women actually getting the vote, in Northern Ireland, for the Catholic nationalist community, it's only 50 years since they got the vote. They had to have a civil rights movement to be heard. They had to go through the years of the Troubles to have their voice heard, and yet in this debate we're actively saying they cannot have a debate or a say on whether abortion is extended in Northern Ireland. And what do they get? I'm sure the honourable member is laughing, but what do the Catholic nationalist communities get in Northern Ireland now? They get no representation in this place, despite having a vote, because their elected representatives fail to show up. They get no representatives in Stormont on this issue, because their elected representatives fail to get round the table. And now we are saying to them they'll get no representation on abortion law changes, because we don't want to have them to have a referendum. We're saying to them that the women in Westminster know best. That's not only insulting, it's undemocratic, and it flies in the face of women's rights and women's choices. I'm very happy to have a debate in this place, Mr. Speaker, on all aspects of abortion. But let's look, if we're truly serious about having modern abortion laws, about the time limit that's set in the UK. We're seeing in the Republic of Ireland in the recent referendum, they will just set their time limit to 12 weeks, as is the case in Austria, in Belgium, in Bulgaria, in the Czech Republic, in Denmark, in Estonia, in France, Germany, Greece, Hungary, Italy, Latvia, Lithuania, Luxembourg, Poland and Slovakia. In Northern Ireland, it's 30, in Netherlands, it's 13 weeks. In Portugal, it's 16 weeks. It's Romania, it's 14 weeks. In a Comres poll, 70% of women in the United Kingdom would like to see the time limit reduced. If we're going to have a modern-day abortion in this country, let's have an honest and genuine discussion. And let's not hide behind pretending this is about rights for women in Northern Ireland. Because if women want to change it, we should be promoting that they have the say. If we're going to have a debate, Mr. Speaker, on abortion in the United Kingdom, we need to explicitly ban sex-selective abortions which proactively discriminate against female babies. We need to equalise the time limits for terminations between those who have got a disability and those who are able-bodied. And we need to have a debate about independent counselling. This is about women's choice, this is about women's rights, but let's hear about the whole debate and not just selective messages from members opposite.
Diana Johnson.
Since I've been in Parliament, the debates that we've had in this place have always been about restricting and reducing women's right to abortion and the right to choose. And three things have happened, actually, in the last 12 months which have given me some heart, that's heartened me. First of all, last year in March, we had a debate in the House of Commons, actually, which the Honourable Lady for Lewis responded to, on a 10-minute rule bill to actually do what my honourable friend for Walthamstow is putting forward today, which is to repeal Section 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Persons Act. And actually, in that debate, I think the House listened very carefully, and when we had that vote, the Parliament voted to support that idea. So I was heartened by that. It was the first time we'd seen any progressive step around what had happened since the 1967 Abortion Act came in. The second point, of course, is the referendum in Ireland, and we look to what happened there and we see how that has shone that spotlight now on what the position is in Northern Ireland and how we do need to do something about it. And the third point is, I think, about the court case that we're going to have the judgment for on Thursday, which I think, and I hope, the Supreme Court will set out that the human rights issues for women have, in fact, the Article 3 and the Article 8 claims have been upheld. And then that means that the British government have to take some action, because human rights are not devolved to the Assembly. They're something that this Parliament needs to deal with. Now, the Honourable Lady, the member of the Health Select Committee, also said that times were changing and we need to prepare and be ready. Now, I'd just like to offer to the Treasury bench something that I've been producing along with Gordon Nodell, who's a QC, and Professor Sally Sheldon, which is actually a new abortion act for this country, for the UK, for England and Wales, I should say. It sets out very clearly how you decriminalise abortion, as has happened in Australia, in one of the states in Australia, and there hasn't been an increase in late-term abortions. And I have to say to the Honourable Lady for Lewis and the Honourable Lady for Congleton that my proposals last year and the ones that I'm supporting with the Honourable Lady for Walthamstow are very clearly about abortions up to 24 weeks. And the Infant Life Preservation Act will stay on the statute books post 24 weeks. I think it's important that we update the legislation that we have on abortion to make it actually woman-centred and about the health needs of women, and actually to reflect the medical changes since the 67 Act was brought in. And I also want to bring into any new abortion law a new offence. So to make it an offence to coerce a woman into having an abortion, make that a specific offence. And I hope the Honourable Lady for Lewis will support me on that, because she's made a lot about that and sex selection abortion. So I want a specific offence about that. And I also want a specific offence about causing abortion by the use of force or violence, or the non-consensual administration of abortion tablets. So I think there are measures we need to introduce in any new bill to protect women and support women. But fundamentally, I ask this question: why is it that countries like Poland and the United States of America don't criminalise their women, and we in this country still have on the statute books the offences under Section 58 and 59 criminalising women who seek to have an abortion?
Lady Allen.
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is a hard and emotive topic. Northern Ireland is a devolved administration, so is it our business? I'm a modern, progressive woman in this country, and I am proud that this country is my home. As a woman who believes passionately in equality, in choice, and individuals' right to determine their own destiny. As a woman elected to be the Member of Parliament for South Cambridge in the 21st century, who stood yesterday to support the Member for Walthamstow's request for this debate, because she is standing up for all the women in the UK, but mostly because I have been there, I'm making it my business. Yeah. The Irish referendum result spoke volumes about how people in Southern Ireland felt. They wanted change and they voted for it decisively. How can it be that Northern Ireland will soon be the only part of Great Britain and Ireland where terminations are, to all intents and purposes, outlawed? Yeah. I was ill when I made the incredibly hard decision to have a termination. I was having seizures every day. I wasn't even able to control my own body, let alone care for a new life. So, Mr. Speaker, are you seriously telling me that in a civilised world, rape, incest, or a fetus that is so sadly deformed that it could never live are not sufficient grounds for a woman to have the power to decide for herself? That she shouldn't make that decision? No, enough. Very suddenly and unexpectedly, we have a window of opportunity before us. Whether you feel that window has opened as a consequence of no functioning devolved administration in Northern Ireland, or because a neighbouring referendum was so close and so relevant as to be impossible to ignore, or simply because you feel the glaring light of equality and human rights illuminating the women of Northern Ireland. This has become their moment, and they will have my unequivocal support.
Thank you. Sammy Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think that the speech from the Honourable Lady for South Cambridgeshire did and does highlight the deeply sensitive nature of this debate. And many people watching this will empathise with the point that she has made. But equally, there will be many people watching this debate today who will feel that the deeply held values which they have about the importance of life and the importance of preserving life also need to be reflected in this debate. We have heard much and many quotes about the committee, in the United Nations Committee and its view on what is happening to women in Northern Ireland. But equally, if we're going to look at what the United Nations says, the United Nations Charter actually talks about the protection of the rights of the child, including the unborn child, and indicates that those rights are equally important.
I thank him very much for giving way. Will he understand that people who, like me, actually also would never have an abortion herself, will support that women should have the right to choose? It's not for us here to make that decision. It is for the individual to make that very personal decision.
But this debate has got two sides to it. And of course it's got the views of those people who wish to control their own bodies, but it's also got, and the side which I think has been lacking in most of the speeches, is what about the unborn child? And what rights and what protections does the state afford to those unborn children? Now, to listen to this debate, one would imagine that in Northern Ireland there is no consideration has been given to the views of the population. But of course, we have had a debate more recently than the debate in this House in the Assembly in Northern Ireland, where it was decided, and it was decided across the parties, that the current legislation should stand, albeit with a review of some of that legislation, and that review has been outlined by my honourable friend for Lagan Valley. But as a result of the legislation which we have in Northern Ireland, which, by the way, I am not embarrassed about, and which, by the way, is balanced, because it does protect the woman and her mental health and her physical health, while at the same time recognising the rights of the unborn child. And as a result, I'll give way, yes.
Grateful to the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. So what's he going to do about it? That's what I would ask the Honourable Gentleman. Are you going to get 724 women that came to this country to have abortions? What are you going to do? Make them stay in Northern Ireland, have children that they don't want? What's your solution?
And our solution to that is, first of all, that since this is a devolved issue, this is an issue which will be decided and will reflect the views of the people of Northern Ireland. And the Scottish shadow spokesman for Northern Ireland outlined it very well. There are reasons for devolving issues across the United Kingdom, because devolved administrations are meant to reflect the views of the people of the areas which they represent. And I believe that the laws in Northern Ireland do reflect the views of the people of Northern Ireland. That is why the Northern Ireland Assembly has voted to maintain those particular laws. But let me go a point further. As a result of, and this is why I am not embarrassed about the laws that we have, nor do I believe we have turned the clock back. As a result of not introducing the legislation which exists here in the rest of the United Kingdom, reflecting the views of the people of Northern Ireland. As a result of that, making both child and parents matter has indicated that both lives matter have indicated that there are 100,000 people alive in Northern Ireland today who would otherwise have been killed before they were even born. Right. Killed before they were even born. Right. And I know that that message is not liked, and indeed so much so that the pro-abortion lobby tried to get the Advertising Standards Authority to challenge it. They found that statistically that was a correct figure. So we have people today in Northern Ireland who are rearing families, who are contributing to society, who are building their businesses, who are working in our factories, who are sitting in our schools, who otherwise, if we had had the legislation which exists here in the rest of the United Kingdom, would have been discarded and put in a bin before they were ever born. And I've got to say, that is one of the reasons. That is one of the reasons why that is one of the reasons.
Order. This debate has so far been conducted with passion, but also with respect. The honourable gentleman must be heard, and whether he takes interventions is up to him. Please, I appeal to colleagues to respect each other. Sammy Wilson.
And one of the reasons why I believe that the legislation we have in Northern Ireland, which is balanced, which respects both the health of the woman and the rights of the unborn child, reflecting, by the way, what the United Nations says in its charter about the rights of unborn children. I believe that we have got the correct balance. And if there are hard cases, and those hard cases have been looked at, we have got the process in place for doing it. But the one thing I would say to members here is that the devolved settlement allows us to make those decisions. I believe that those decisions and the way in which people vote for parties in Northern Ireland reflects that, by and large, they are content with that. Of course, it will not satisfy everyone. There are people who are opposed to the legislation, but I believe that the legislation we have does reflect the views of the people of Northern Ireland. That's what devolution is all about. That's why the decision should not be made in this House, and that's why we certainly shouldn't have a change in the law which would leave no protection at all for people in Northern Ireland, because it would leave a political a legislative vacuum.
Vicky Ford.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Abortion is rightly a very emotional issue, and people have very strong personal views. This is not the first time in my life when I've been asked to vote on abortion. During my 8 years in the European Parliament, I found that MEPs vote on abortion nearly every month. Every time that Parliament considers foreign policy in another part of the world, there is a detailed statement about human rights, birth control and abortion. I voted on abortion policy in countries as far afield as Russia, China, India and all over the world. And if you check my voting record, you will see that I always support the woman's right to choose. I always support the woman's right to access contraception, and I never support the death penalty. The debate in Ireland shone a light. The people of the Republic of Ireland voted for reform, and we, as their nearest neighbours, should support their decision. But the debate before us today is whether or not we should repeal parts of our own UK abortion law, specifically the sections which make it a crime for a woman to try to cause her own abortion, or for anyone to help her, or to supply anything that causes that abortion. And this type of criminalisation is out of line with most other Western countries, and I understand the calls to modernise the law. But repealing those two sections does not solve the issue. If they are repealed, there will need to be new safeguards to protect women and a new legal framework. And in my many votes in the European Parliament, I was also acutely aware of how challenging it is when politicians in one part of the world try to tell others what to do, especially on moral issues. The detailed legal framework must be a matter for locally accountable politicians. In Northern Ireland, there are very deeply held views. Polls suggest the majority do want reform, but there's not agreement on the detail. Some say abortion should be permitted where there's a life-changing, a life-limiting conditions. Others say for rape or incest, and others say they want the same laws that side of the water as we have this side of the water. and these issues need to be considered. And as someone who was born and went to Sunday school in Northern Ireland, I see the huge sensitivities that could arise if we in Westminster try to legislate over the heads of the devolved government. It is a devolved issue. But for nearly over a year, the parties in Northern Ireland have not taken up their seats. The members have taken their salaries, but they've not taken their responsibilities. And that has left people in many areas to face uncertainty. And decisions do need to be made. If the Supreme Court decides that the Northern Irish abortion laws breach the European Convention of Human Rights, then this government will have to take action. The UK is a champion for human rights all over the world. We cannot turn a blind eye, and we will be forced to act. I do not want this House to have to take action on matters that should be decided locally. So it's right that the Secretary of State has gone over there to kick-start the Get in the Assembly again. This is time for an Assembly. It's time to redouble the efforts. And Assembly members of Northern Ireland, I know you are listening. If you truly care about the women of Northern Ireland, if you truly care about the babies of the women of Northern Ireland, now is the time to show leadership, now is the time to take up your seats, and now is the time to take your decisions. Otherwise, I fear we may have to.
Jess Phillips.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Recently, I had to hire a car. It turned out that the cheapest and best option for me was to hire it from Birmingham Airport. When I got in the car, I turned on the onboard sat-nav, and the last journey taken was to the Colthorpe Clinic in Edgbaston, the place I myself had been for an abortion a decade previously. I shuddered at the thought of the woman who had hired the car before me, not to go about her working life, but to go and do something that I take completely for granted. Myself and the member for South Cambridgeshire are not criminals. Last week, I asked the women of Northern Ireland to get in touch and tell me their stories of travelling to England, Scotland and Wales. Today, I am them. Here are some of the extracts. It was Christmas Eve. I was with friends at a party. I stepped outside for a breath of air and I was raped. My mum had to book the flights, book me into a clinic. This all took money. I was from a working class family. We had to borrow it. I had to travel on my own. I'd never been alone anywhere after I'd been raped. I was in a relationship with an abusive man. I knew if I carried on with this pregnancy, I would lose my job, my home, and the ability to look after the children I already had. My consultant told me that following legal advice, medical staff were not allowed to provide any information to help me get an abortion. I cried on the phone when I rang Mary Stopes in Belfast. They told me how much it would cost to book a medical abortion. I considered taking too many antidepressants, not enough to kill myself, just to induce a miscarriage. I was 15, standing in McDonald's car park in a freezing December weather, staring at the boy much older than me, minutes after finding I was pregnant. I was terrified that someone would see me standing in my school uniform. I went to Liverpool 2 months before I turned 16 and 8 weeks after having sex with a boy who no longer wanted to know my name. The shame I felt lingered long after I'd made the 8-hour boat journey back to Northern Ireland. The taxi driver who...
Thank my honourable friend for giving way, and I think she has just very ably demonstrated this in her speech. But does she agree with me? For the vast majority of women, having an abortion at whatever stage is a heart-rending decision that is rarely taken without huge consideration.
I absolutely agree, and I think that also I'd like to stick up for the women who aren't the difficult cases as well as those that are. I'll go back to the stories. The taxi driver who picked us up in Birmingham from the flight was kind. He drove right past the protesters outside the clinic and called them horrible people. He wouldn't accept mum's money for the fare. I realised he saw many girls like me. I wasn't alone. I did not want to travel on my own, so I had to wait for my friend to get time off work. Leicester isn't exactly easy to get to, so we set off at 4 a.m. on our flight. an hour's bus journey into Leicester and another 45 minutes on another bus to get to the clinic. After the procedure, me and my friend had to go and catch a flight again. Again, another 2 bus journeys. It took near 3 hours this time to get back to the airport. Another flight, then we went back to the house. Drained, exhausted, emotional, sore. The night before I was due to fly to London, I had some minor bleeding, and by the time I boarded the plane, I was in some discomfort. Immediately the plane took off. I made my way to the toilet. I was bleeding heavily. When a female steward eventually knocked on the door, I told her I was unwell and suffered heavy periods. Of course, she knew, but she said nothing. I was first off the plane, and the young steward who accompanied me to the public toilets in Heathrow Airport. She tried to persuade me to see a doctor or nurse, but I was terrified. I went to the cubicle, and I passed everything into the toilet, and I flushed it. When I returned to Belfast, I did see my GP, who was horrified and told me that I could have died. The final story of my speech sums up what each and every woman who got in touch, and it was hundreds. So I will finish with this. Despite my mental health issues, despite an abusive partner, despite having no money and no real sense of where I was going, I was expected to have this baby. But I didn't want to be pregnant, and that's really why I went to England. Afterwards, I felt sore, but mostly angry, that I'd been made to board a plane because the government that laid claim to my country demanded it legislates better for its English citizens than for its Northern Irish people. Because Westminster allows our women to be deprived of the basic human rights they give to their English citizens.
Thank you. Hugh Merriman.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to follow the honourable member for Birmingham Yardley, who always speaks powerfully and emotively on these subjects. And I'm conscious, Mr. Speaker, of as I've sat through this debate in silence, and I've listened to many points being debated, some of which I vehemently disagree with, but I think it's important in this chamber that we listen with respect to every opinion, and we don't think that we have a monopoly on those opinions, no matter how much we disagree with them. Quite frankly, if we do otherwise, then we're setting a terrible example to the rest of the country. And I look particularly to my friends in Northern Ireland, who I know serve their community incredibly well, and they know their community and they're from their community. And I think, quite frankly, some of the etiquette directed towards them is not really befitting of this place. But I say that, actually, having found myself in agreement with the honourable member for Walthamstow in terms of her position. I fundamentally believe in the rights of women to be able to choose what to do with their bodies, and I think it's incredibly important, if we are one United Kingdom, albeit of course with devolved parts, that we have basic rights that everybody in the United Kingdom can enjoy. And that's the issue I have with the law as it currently stands. Now, Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't be standing up and making these points if we truly did have a working devolution with Northern Ireland right now, because it would be a matter for Northern Ireland, because in practice, as well as by rule, these powers would be enacted in Northern Ireland. But the difficulty I have, Mr. Speaker, is that it's been now 18 months since powers have ceased to continue. And the difficulty I have, and although I'm obviously not a representative for Northern Ireland, is for how long will the people of Northern Ireland have to continue where they're in a democracy, but their ability to reform, as opposed to just continue and carry on, has an absolute impediment because there is no executive functioning and no assembly. And it comes to a point in time, Mr. Speaker, that as times change, and we've seen the mood from the Republic of Ireland, and we have a situation, a legal case from 1938, Crown versus Bourne, that still largely governs the right of abortion in Northern Ireland, that a woman has to become a physical or mental wreck until that can be invoked, that I, as a representative of this United Kingdom Parliament, just cannot stand by and see that occurring. And I think it's a duty, I believe, on every honourable member to put their head above the parapet and say that if we believe that this is not right any longer, then we have to make a stand for others in the United Kingdom that have the rights that my constituents have. And that's what causes me to rise as I do. I, of course, hope that the Northern Ireland people, led by their Democrats, are able to form a functioning administration, in which case they can take the powers back and they can make those decisions themselves. But the difficulty I have is that I cannot just sit behind a wall that says it's nothing to do with me because there's devolution, when devolution is not functioning. So on that basis, Mr Speaker, I do support the Honourable Member for Walthamstow. I give her great credit for the courage that she's led this debate. I also believe that there comes a point in time for the rest of the United Kingdom law to be updated as well. It's not the case, Mr Speaker, that we should have rights on the basis that there are exemptions. Those rights should be there for women, and we should ensure that they are kept up to date with medical advances as well. So I'm glad we're having this debate today, and I very much support the move that the Honourable Member for Walthamstow has brought.
Thank you. Liz Saville-Roberts.
Then it's an honour to be a co-signatory with the member for Walthamstow in securing this debate. The 1861 Offences Against the Person Act is a Victorian consolidation statute kept workable only by means of regular reinterpretations and case law, a creaking legislative machine held together by bolt-on updates. Unalloyed, this Act makes criminals of both desperate women and compassionate doctors. The decision to decriminalise abortion is a human rights question and thus a reserved matter for Westminster. If the decision were made to decriminalise abortion, if it were no longer a crime with exemptions, it would then become a devolved healthcare competency. And Wales, where criminal justice is not devolved, would have greater powers than is presently the case. And what could we do with such powers in Wales? Well, firstly, we could consider the need for 2 doctors' signatures. In an area like rural Dwyfan Meirionydd, this means a visit to 2 different GPs or a visit to a GP and the BPS Services Clinic in Llandudno. In much of Wales, there's only an option of 2 GPs, with all the fear of being recognised, fear of being talked about, and stigma, and all that this entails in close communities. Remember, these are places where your mother knows the GPs, and everyone's afraid that the receptionist knows everybody's business and will be talking about it. Across much of Wales, there is a shortage of accessible GPs, so much so that in Cardiff, 12% of women attend private abortion clinics because they're afraid the procedure through the NHS will be too slow for them. If it were truly devolved, the National Assembly of Wales could also move ahead with confidence in our powers to allow women to undertake the second stage of a medical abortion at home, rather than having to be seen by medics at a clinic twice. Think about this. Now, as things stand, having to travel either in a car or by public transport back home from the clinic with the effects of a medical abortion starting on you as you travel. Think about the recommendation that you shouldn't drive yourself to and from the clinic and all that means in terms of confidentiality. Do you tell your mother? Do you tell your grandmother? Do they come with you? Does your best friend come with you? This is what the contemporary law means for women in Wales because of a piece of legislation that was patched together 157 years ago. Repealing sections 58 and 59 of OIAP would allow devolution to change this. And arguing that devolution postulment is a reason to deny this for Wales is ironic, frankly, considering Clause 11 of the EU Withdrawal Bill and the power grab implicit in that. Mr Speaker, the criminalisation of abortion does not prevent abortion. The Guttmacher Institute publishes figures showing that abortion rates in countries with prohibition stand at 37 per 1,000 women, and 34 per 1,000 women in countries where abortion is not restricted, virtually identical. Highly restrictive practices do not eliminate the practice of abortion, but they reduce women's safety and they increase the distress of women undertaking the procedure. To close now, let's face it, no one wants an abortion, but our control of our own lives must not be at the mercy of biology. Deciding whether to have children, when and how many children to have, is a fundamental human right. Diolch yn fawr.
Owen Smith.
very much, Mr. Speaker. May I start by congratulating my honourable friend, the member for Walthamstow, for bringing the debate to the House today. She did so very eloquently and made a compelling case for the decriminalisation of abortion across the whole of the UK. She shouldn't have had to make that case because it had already been made brilliantly by my honourable friend, the member for Hull North, last year. We should have enacted that already. But the honourable member for Walthamstow also made an excellent case about the compatibility of what she was proposing today with the devolution laws, and that's an important point to make. But I want to rise as a former Shadow Secretary of State for Wales and for Northern Ireland for fully half of the time I've been in this place to say that, in my view, the choice for women and compassion should trump all of those constitutional concerns. That is what we should be deciding as a legislature, either here in this House or in Northern Ireland, because although I am a devolutionist who some believes we need to respect the devolution settlement in all parts of the UK, I'm also someone who believes fundamentally in the universality of human rights, including the right of women in all parts of the UK, indeed in all parts of the world, to choose in respect of their bodies, and to have a legal system and a healthcare system which respects their choices and which looks after their health and well-being. And the abortion laws in Northern Ireland, however they have been derived and however long-standing the conventions, and whatever, in many respects, the views of the politicians of Northern Ireland, do not respect and protect the human rights and the health and well-being of the women of Northern Ireland, and that is why they should be changed. Ideally in Stormont, but if Stormont is unable to rise to that challenge, then by this place. I give way to my honourable friend.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to him for giving way. Every man in this chamber has control and choice about their reproductive health care. Any man in this chamber can have a vasectomy if they wish to, without threat of prosecution. As a woman, I have no control or choice. Does he agree with me that this is, for all the complexities of the Northern Ireland political situation, this is a matter of equality and human rights?
Yes, I'm grateful for my honourable friend for that excellent intervention. She makes the absolute clear point. Devolution necessarily means that there will be differences between different jurisdictions in the UK, but it should not mean that people in any one part of the UK have a diminished set of rights. And that is the case that we are dealing with here in Northern Ireland. I became utterly convinced of this case, Mr. Speaker, when I led a delegation of Labour MPs to Northern Ireland earlier this year to hear directly from the women of Northern Ireland their experiences. One of the women who spoke to us was someone who has been mentioned several times today in this chamber, Sarah Ewart, who has become a great champion for the cause of reform in Northern Ireland. Her story is typical. She was diagnosed at 19 weeks as having a fetus with anencephaly, a fatal neural tube defect. The baby was never going to live. She was unaware of the set of circumstances whereby she went to her GP, asked for an abortion, only to be told that she couldn't have one. She ended up spending over £2,500 coming to England, being traumatised in the process, to undergo a not terribly satisfactory procedure. She is one of hundreds of women undertaking that journey. She is one of thousands of women who've contemplated or have sought medication on the internet in order to bring about an early termination. That cannot be right in 2018 in any part of the UK. It cannot be right that we endure circumstances whereby we have Victorian practices of backroom abortions growing in a part of the United Kingdom. It should simply be unacceptable. I want to briefly, Mr. Speaker, talk about the politics of this, because honourable members from Northern Ireland have spoken with knowledge of their communities, but I don't think we've heard a completely full account of where public opinion lies in Northern Ireland, nor of where the political situation, because one of the parties in Northern Ireland has changed its views recently. Sinn Féin has moved its position, and other political parties, notably the UUP, have said previously that this would be a matter of conscience were it to be a vote in the Northern Ireland Assembly. So it is not black and white that there is political opposition across the board to this, nor is it right that there is public opposition, because some polls, the most recent polls, have shown that up to 75% of people in Northern Ireland of all faiths and none believe that there should be decriminalisation in Northern Ireland. I am pleased to, I won't give way, I'm afraid, I am pleased to hear the Secretary of State say earlier that there will be a free vote in this House on the part of the Conservative Party if this were to come before the House. I hope, therefore, that it will come before the House at the earliest opportunity, and I look forward to voting with Conservative members to change the law for Northern Ireland.
Thank you. Alison Hewless.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would like to pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Walthamstow and all of those who have been brave enough to speak in this debate, and also to those in the women's sector in Northern Ireland who are watching on, and they are the most tremendous bunch of feminists you will ever meet, and I would encourage everybody to do so. I want to speak briefly, Mr Speaker, about the impact of women not having the right to choose and what happens when those options are restricted. The restriction of child tax credits and the child element of universal credit to the first 2 children in a family is a cruel policy which I am well on record as opposing. But what's not often discussed is the choices that this drives women to. Benefits Helpline turned to us, surveyed callers affected by the 2-child policy. 700 people said it affected their decision to have another child. A number of women had opted for abortions for wanted babies rather than pursue a pregnancy which they felt they could not afford. Some with religious beliefs or whose pregnancies were too far along could not do so. But as abhorrent, as despicable and cruel that this UK Government policy is forcing women to terminate a pregnancy, the fact remains that unlike women in Scotland, England and Wales, women in Northern Ireland are not afforded that choice. The Honourable Member for Birmingham Yardley talked very compassionately about the women who travel, but that option indeed is not open to all either. Those who are in poverty, those who are in abusive relationships, single parents, those with childcare issues, those with insecure immigration status and those with disabilities cannot often travel. They can't afford to, and they practically can't. They then take the pills that are bought over the internet, and those most marginalised women are also now the most likely to be criminalised. Mr Speaker, that situation is absolutely unsustainable and must be challenged. Mr Speaker, for historic reasons, family size in Northern Ireland is on average higher than the rest of the UK, and the 2-child policy has a disproportionate effect. There's a certain irony, really, Mr Speaker, that DUP members, in propping up the Tories and supporting social security cuts, which will leave families less able to provide for the children that they have, are supporting this kind of policy while opposing abortion law changes. The 2-child policy will put 250,000 more children into poverty by 2020. Families will lose out by at least £2,780 per year, and women in Northern Ireland are left in a trap. They are unable to access child tax credits. They are unable to access abortion, and women who are in particular circumstances of abuse cannot access contraception. The member from Walthamstow mentioned that it's almost like we are in Gilead, and for some of these women, they are left in that situation where they have very little control over their reproductive rights. Mr Speaker, I trust women. I believe in their right to choose, and I hope the Supreme Court does as well. Our sisters in Northern Ireland have been left behind and left out for far, far too long, and I urge that there is progress made on this issue as a matter of urgency.
Thank you. Jim Shannon.
Speaker, and first of all, can I thank you for the opportunity to speak on this issue and say to you all right honourable and honourable members in this chamber to respect our hard-held and heartfelt views and opinions that we have, which may be very different from some of the people who have spoken, but may be in kilter with some of those who have. This debate today is an opportunistic move on the back of the so-called momentum of the Irish referendum to see abortion on the ban with no restriction brought into the UK. That's my opinion. It may not be everybody's opinion in this place, but that's how I feel about it. And with that in case, let's be clear, this means that babies can be disposed of when their hearts are beating and also removed from the womb. I am diametrically opposed to that happening for a number of reasons, and I want to perhaps just hit upon those 3 reasons quite quickly if I can. Firstly, I've stood in this chamber, I've written to the ministers, I've written to many people who have, I think, had power, and permanent secretaries to ministers, to states, to allocate and release funding to address the crisis point that our health service and education services are at. Devolution demands that Stormont makes major policy determinations, not the members in this place. Why will we debate this issue which is not taking on the reins in addressing the A&E crisis and GP surgery closures? Other members have referred to it. We're just debating one issue, but we're not debating the critical issues of how health and education works. As far as I'm concerned, secondly, the referendum in Ireland has no bearing on the democratic process in Northern Ireland. Full stop. They had a referendum because their constitution demanded that. We have no need for that, simply for a working assembly. Does this mean that so much to Michelle O'Neill with her North is next statement and sign? No, it doesn't. And is the Northern Ireland next? Bring it to the Assembly and see how many will put their name to this change. The last time this was debated in the Assembly, there was a decision of 59 votes to 40 to leave the law as it was, cross-party, cross-community, cross-support, and no petition of concern. Now, you can ignore that if you want. It's a fact of life. Quite happy to give way.
Thank the member for giving way, and just in doing that, the last time we were in the Northern Ireland Assembly where this was debated, evidence was brought forward that on many occasions it was not just one abortion. Many people had multiple abortions and were using it as a form of contraceptive.
I thank my honourable friend for his comment, and I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend. Would he not agree that if this is such an important issue for Northern Ireland, they best quick get their assembly up and running? Otherwise, what we will find is increasingly this chamber deciding issues on behalf of Northern Ireland which should legitimately be decided by the Assembly itself. My vote goes, we should never put women in a position that they seek backstreet abortions. Many of us will have older relatives who were in that position. But it goes back to Northern Ireland, to actually get the Assembly running.
I thank the two honourable gentlemen for their interventions, and can I say to the honourable gentleman who intervened last that I agree with him that the Assembly should make that decision. I think we all want that to happen, and if it was the Assembly making that decision, I'm quite sure that nothing would change in relation to the legislation that we have in place.
Sorry, I thank the member. I thank the member for giving way. Just a very quick point. We've heard a couple of references to the increase or to backstreet abortions. Does the member agree with me? There is no evidence at all that there is any backstreet abortion activity ongoing, never mind increasing, in Northern Ireland. There are issues, and we've indicated that we will deal with those compassionately, but that is not an issue in Northern Ireland at the moment, as far as we're aware.
I thank the honourable lady for our factual and evidence. Thirdly, can I stand and just say this? I do have an opinion, and I want to state that opinion just right now. It is my belief, Mr. Speaker, that a child is a child from conception, which is increasingly being shown by medical advances, showing a heart beating clearly from 3 weeks. One lady in my office said, if a doctor declares you dead if your heart stops beating, then you must be declared alive whenever your heart is beating. And it is also determined by women around me, those who are religious and those who are not. Those who have lost their babies at 12 weeks and grieve, and women who have carried their babies full term. I've known quite a lot of ladies who have done that. My opinion is formed on the use of the Abortion Act in the mainland. And let's just look at the 67 Abortion Act. It was brought in with conditions, with rules, with criteria, but what it ended up was abortion on demand. And where's the facts of that? In 2015 in England and Wales there were 697,852 live births and 185,824 abortions. So for every 3 children who are born, 1 is aborted. If that's not abortion on demand, I'd like to know what is. In the last 10 years in England and Wales, out of almost 2 million abortions, only 4 were recorded as for the purpose of to save the life of the mother. Again, the conditions of the 67 Abortion Act were for the right reasons from the point of view of trying to save the young children, but did they do that? No, they didn't. In Northern Ireland, we've had approximately 50 abortions. So you can't have abortions in Northern Ireland if the conditions are correct. It takes 2 GPs and on the condition in relation to the welfare, the health and the safety of the expectant mother. We have a system that works and is better than the United Kingdom's legislation. It's certainly going to be better in the Republic of Ireland as well. Our party believes that both lives matter, the mother's life and the child. And 100,000 children are alive today, and my honourable colleague for East Antrim has referred to that, and people are alive today because of that. One member in the chamber mentioned earlier on about national opinion polls, and let's mention one of the national opinion polls that came out at the weekend. When voters were asked whether they, in Northern Ireland, whether they supported abortion simply because a woman did not want the child, only 34% said yes, and 60% said no. So there isn't a demand amongst the general public for abortion on demand the way that this legislation will push it through if they get that opportunity. I'm called to be a legislator, and I have to weigh up the number of these cases against a number of those who abuse the legislation as a means of birth control. I believe it is the good of our nation to protect our babies in their mother's womb and to support that woman. I believe it is wrong to ask doctors to take the life of a child within the womb, and I believe that there is another way. We must advocate for that. I believe that the woman and her body matter, but so does the life of the child. Let's remember the child. People don't disregard it, but let's not disregard it. I'm not disregarding, and this party will not disregard it. Do not ask this place to impose a Northern Ireland law which does not reflect the will of the elected representatives and, in my opinion, the overwhelming view of the people of every side of the political debate. Life is precious. Both lives matter.
Jardine.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'd also like to thank the honourable member for Walthamstow and everyone who supported her in bringing this debate, which is, for me, of vital importance, not in a party political sense, not even in any political sense, but in a human rights sense. For me, there are two issues here. One is that it is simply appalling that abortion is still treated as a criminal rather than a medical issue in 2018. That we are standing here today, more than 100 years, only just more than 100 years after women were given the vote, debating an act from 1861. Well, not only was it all men in the chamber who decided, it was all men who voted for all the men in the chamber to decide. And even now, the other issue is that women in Northern Ireland are the only women across the UK who are denied a fundamental human right, the right to choose, the right to control their own bodies. And I've heard the debate about devolution, and as someone who has campaigned consistently and whose party has campaigned timelessly for devolution, I cannot find myself supporting that argument, because I listened to what my honourable friend from Edinburgh North and Leith had to say, but then I listened to what the honourable member for Birmingham Yardley had to say, and I thought, you know, if I were one of those women sitting at home listening to us today, what would matter to me more? Devolution and a political principle, or my human rights? And it would be my human rights and my right to choose. It would be my daughter's human rights, my niece's human rights, every woman I know's human rights above a political principle. And if that is not enough, then perhaps we should look at what the legislation says, because human rights are not devolved. There is a precedent in 2007 when the DUP blocked the EU Gender Directive. Westminster stepped in and intervened. And legislation also gives the UK Parliament responsibility for meeting international obligations, such as UN treaties ratified by the UK. And UN bodies have found that Northern Ireland abortion law is incompatible with human rights treaties ratified by this Parliament. And that is also the view of Amnesty International, who've said that Northern Ireland's laws have been repeatedly found by UN treaty monitoring bodies to be in significant violation of the various human rights treaties the UK is a state party to. We are not in a situation where we are trying to usurp the rights of the Stormont Parliament. It is not sitting at the moment, but if it were, I'm sorry if you don't mind because of the time limitations. We are not trying to usurp the rights of that Parliament. We are simply trying to establish the rights of women throughout the UK, to put those rights on an equal footing, to give every woman the choice. And in this law, in this change, by repealing sections 58 and 59, the Parliament in Northern Ireland would, as we have heard, be able to decide for itself how it proceeded. So I would like to give my complete support to this debate today, not just for myself,
but for those women who have a right, a human right, for our children throughout the UK, that they all are on an equal footing.
Karen Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I am a strong supporter of women's right to autonomy and choice, and I think it is right that we highlight the appalling treatment of women in Northern Ireland in this place, as we would do discrimination in other parts of the world. It is also right that, given the 1861 Act is a UK law, that this Parliament debates it, and I hope in time does repeal the relevant sections. I do, however, want to use this brief time to utter a few words of caution about the next steps, the next political steps we take to make the change that we want to see. I am Vice Chair of the British Irish Parliamentary Assembly on our Committee D at the moment, with many honourable members who are present today. We are currently in the middle of an inquiry into abortion across all jurisdictions of Britain and Ireland, including the Isle of Man, which I don't think has been mentioned today. We paused our work for the Irish referendum, but we will continue that debate after this weekend and in the coming months. The vote on the 8th Amendment in the Republic of Ireland is transformative, not just for women in the Republic of Ireland, but for women across the world whose politicians haven't heeded the need for change, and votes of what's been termed conscience. It has major implications both in Northern Ireland in terms of the debates and rights of wrongs of abortions, but also for the practical realities. It is transformative for all people across the island of Ireland. Women from Northern Ireland have the ability to travel into the Republic now for this service once it is up and running. They won't have to get on a plane or a boat. They could walk into Cavan or Monaghan or Donegal at any point and probably have access to this service. They can get a short bus ride. Would women have to apply for funding, as agreed by this Parliament, to travel into the Republic of Ireland? Do the reciprocal healthcare rights apply to terminations? Do they apply as part of the European Union? Do they apply under the spirit and the rules governing the Good Friday Belfast Agreement? Has the Secretary of State, as I asked earlier, discussed this with the Irish Government about the implementation? There is merit in an all-Ireland Ireland view across this issue. There is a debate in Northern Ireland as to whether this is a human rights or a healthcare issue, one being our purview, the other not. It isn't a binary issue. This issue is helping to spotlight the scandal that is the Assembly collapse. If the politicians cannot agree, how are we going to get them to make some kind of future act? There is discussion about whether a civic forum is the way forward in Northern Ireland. Again, I'm not entirely sure how that would be made a reality given the Assembly is not in place. Now, we've had a lot of assertions today about what people think. Honourable members here present from Northern Ireland are quite right to say they have had a mandate to be here and to say what they are saying. Others have had a mandate not to be here. We don't know what people in Northern Ireland think because we haven't directly asked them. That is the political reality. There is unlikely to be any change in the electoral mathematics in Northern Ireland at any point soon. The law is complex in this area, and it is no good pretending it isn't. I think that we need to understand from the government now how they are going to unblock this situation. They cannot be let off the hook about this issue now. I am not in favour generally of referendums. I think they don't go that way, but I think it is an issue to be considered as a tool to perhaps unblock the political situations. I would like to know what discussions have had or will be had about an all-Ireland situation now that on implementation with the Irish Government. What support will be given to women travelling and accessing service in the Republic of Ireland? And what is stopping the Government now going directly to the people of Northern Ireland for a view on this issue?
Thank you. Hannah Bardell.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and it is a pleasure to speak in this debate. I commend all of the members who have taken part, and I want to thank up front those organisations who have given us briefings in Gender, Scottish Women's Aid, British Pregnancy Advisory Service. And I would just like to quote Ruth Halperin Kadari from CEDAW, the UN Expert Committee, who said, "The situation in Northern Ireland constitutes violence against women that may amount to torture or cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment. We have to bear that in mind in all of these discussions. And as I said in my interventions, Mr Speaker, we have to deploy respect for each other. There are a range of views and a range of proposals that have come across from across the House. I want to congratulate and commend the Honourable Member for Walthamstow for bringing this forward in such a brave fashion. I have to say I am becoming more swayed by the arguments as the debate has gone on. But to hear members of the DUP suggest that women are opting for abortions as a matter of convenience, unborn children being thrown in the bin or babies being disposed of, is a disgusting way to describe the choices that women have to make anywhere in the UK, but particularly in Northern Ireland. And the fact that the legislation governing some women's reproductive rights were made at a time when we were passing the Capital Punishment Amendment Act ending public hanging shows what little has been thought of women's health in some areas. They deem it appropriate for our bodies to be governed from a law that's so old, as I said, no one is left to remember it. And we have to recognise the very extraordinary circumstances we find ourselves in, that the Republic has voted. We have to see what legislation comes forward from them and the impact that it will have on women who already travel and on the services in the Republic. In November 2015, a High Court judge ruled that Northern Ireland's almost outright ban on abortion breaches of human rights of women and girls, including rape victims. I have huge sympathy for the women of Northern Ireland. I stand with them. The stories of women travelling alone and scared to another country for an abortion, when many have already endured a trauma, strikes at the very heart of why we're elected, to stand up to injustice and protect our citizens. Now, this is a hugely complex issue, both constitutionally and in terms of human rights. And what I would say is that there was a House of Lords European Committee report that said the issue of human rights and whether they are devolved or reserved is not as clear-cut as it has been presented. I can't give the full details of what I would like to, Mr Speaker, because of time. But we are criminalising women who are in the most desperate of circumstances, as my honourable friend from Glasgow Central has highlighted. And there has been discussions and suggestions around the notion of perhaps a referendum and asking the people of Northern Ireland what they think about this. We have to recognise the different constitutional situation between the North and the Republic. And I have to say I have some sympathy with the women's organisations who are saying, and quite rightly, women's rights are inherent and they should not be up for popular vote. Women in Ireland told their stories to convey the devastating impact of the 8th Amendment, the emotional labour that took for those women to speak out, and we must pay tribute to them. Why would we subject the women of Northern Ireland to the same situation? So I want to say to the Honourable Lady from Walthamstow and others, we have before us today a motion and a statement of intent. I'm not a constitutional expert. I don't have a great legal brain. I have some concerns about the practicalities, but I also see the merits in them. And I will make this commitment to her and to the women of Northern Ireland. Should she bring forward proposals in the domestic violence bill or in another way, I will work with her and others across party to meet with and engage with to look at those proposals. But the Northern Ireland Assembly must come back as soon as possible and get its
extremely grateful to the Honourable Lady. I thank her. Sir Peter Bottomley.
I'm grateful, Mr Speaker. My understanding is that if sections 58 and 59 of the Defence Against People Act are repealed, it will be necessary to have some other civil law, both for England and Wales and for Northern Ireland. I think that the abolition of 58 and 59, which are clearly going to come, there's clearly a majority in the House for that to happen, will then leave to the devolved assemblies and administrations the opportunity to bring forward the laws that they think are appropriate in their own parts of the United Kingdom. The Offences Against People Act doesn't apply, as I understand it, to these aspects in Scotland. That doesn't cause a problem. So the question is how and when and then what? I would like to know who is the most senior person in the DUP who supports what in effect in shorthand can be called the woman's right to choose. Were there any DUP candidates in the last general election who spoke up for a view which is held quite widely in other political parties? and I'm not sure I know the answer to that. There's no answer to now, but at some stage it would be interesting to know whether there actually is a debate and a variety of views within the DUP, which is important in Northern Ireland. The second question is whether we can take out some of the idea that this is a rarity. I don't normally talk about personal circumstances, but I've been involved in about 10 conceptions, 3 of which came to children who were born alive. The other roughly 7 were aborted naturally, miscarriages. I've had people living in my house desperate to have children, gone through late abortions, late miscarriages, and incidentally, those who think a heartbeat starts at 3 weeks, I think they probably find that they're out by about 100%, it's about 6 weeks to 8 weeks, but that's an unimportant detail. The question clearly is, if there's going to be a deliberate termination, can it be as soon as possible rather than as late as pushed by procedure? And that's one of the reasons why I think we need to go examining whether you actually do need to have 2 doctors to approve a formal medical termination, or whether 1 would be sufficient, and what the protocols should be. I think we have to approach this not as we'd like the world to be. It's clearly wrong that in this country as a whole, there are about 190,000 abortions a year. If you allow some to people who have to come in from Spain or Ireland, or Northern Ireland, that leaves about a 40% chance that people in this country will be involved in a conception which is ended by a deliberate termination at some stage. That's common. That's not something for the criminal law. It's something where understanding about how conception takes place, whether people want to have an extra child when they've already got 5, or whether they've conceived with someone they have to say, I'm sorry, what did you say your name was? Or we lived together for 2 years, we hadn't planned this. These are the sorts of circumstances which require openness and open discussion. I think this debate is one which has been important for those who listen to the...
So, I'm grateful to the Honourable Gentleman. What would certainly be a rarity was any legal circumstances where abortion wasn't in some way limited or restricted. We've heard already in this debate that in most countries of the world, abortions can't take place at a much lower age. Would he support that kind of reform?
I think my honourable friend will have heard me say that if an abortion, deliberate abortion is going to take place, the sooner it takes place, the better. It's better if you don't have the circumstances. When you do have them, earlier the better is clearly right. And the civil law will need to replace the criminal law. I end by saying that those who have contributed on both sides of the House, I think, have earned the respect of those outside. If those who oppose change can respect those who want it, we can have a better debate.
Thank you. To wind up the debate, I call Stella Creasy.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank every member who's contributed to this debate, because I hope, first and foremost, that the government has heard what the member for Worthing, my dear friend on this matter, has said. This is a statement of intent. We want deeds, not just words. The women of Northern Ireland, indeed the women of England and Wales, deserve modern abortion law, and we intend to work to give it to them. In order to do that, let me repeat what I said in my speech to counter the scaremongering for the member from Congleton, who I'm sad is not here, who talked about it providing abortion up to birth. No, this is about repealing sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Person Act 1861. It is not about the Infant Presentation Act of 1929. I am disappointed that the government sent a speaker from Northern Ireland who therefore claimed they could not comment on UK legislation, because ultimately what we want is a date. We want a date at which the domestic abuse bill will be brought to this House and the will of this House can be tested. And a date not within the next 150 years, but within the next 150 days. And I share the concern of the member for Lewes to hear the voices of the women and men of Northern Ireland. Indeed, I hope that she will go and listen to the nationalist voices, in particular the Vice President of Sinn Féin herself, Michelle O'Neill, who has said legislative change is required and backs this proposal. So when she speaks up for the nationalist voices, she should be supporting this proposal. As I'm so proud to serve in this House on this issue with the members from South Cambridgeshire, Putney and Broxtowe, who've made such a powerful case for change. But above all, I want to thank the member for East Antrim, who so beautifully illustrated why this change must happen in this House and why it matters. Because he took to the floor of this debate to control this debate. Because control came easily to him. That sensation of being in control and able to make decisions about what happens is what we seek for all our constituents. I will stand up for his right as a Northern Irish man to have control over his body. All we are asking is that he stands up for the rights of Northern Irish women to have control over their bodies too. Not to be criminalised, but to be able to make a choice. And let me be clear to all members of this House, the members of the campaign, the MPs who stand already convinced, the members who want to hear more arguments will know that we also will make a choice. Not to give up fighting for equality, not to give up fighting for the 21st century, not to give up fighting for choice for all. We trust all women. Now is the time for Northern Ireland.
Yeah. Order. The question is that this House has considered the role of the UK Parliament in repealing sections 58 and 59 of the Offences Against the Person Act 1861. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Of the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.